Okay, hello everybody. What is going on? I hope that you can hear me okay. I'm on an Ethernet connection. Okay, so this is actually there's actually a cable running from my PC to my wireless box. This is the first time I've ever tried this. So fingers crossed. We might I don't want to jinx it, but this should be a better stream. This should be a better quality stream. It should run faster, and I shouldn't get many, if any, of the nasty interruptions. Can't hear me. That's a great place to start. Min says he can't hear me. Joy's giving me a 1, which means she can hear me. But Min says he can't hear me. Oh, that's a great place to start. Can you guys hear me? My mic says it's working fine. Guys, can you let me know if you can hear me okay? Okay, we can hear you. Okay, Min, that's up to you then. You got to sort that out, Min. Everyone can hear me fine. All right, brilliant. So back to where I was. So yeah, so we've got Ethernet connection. Hello, Macy. Hi, Joy. Hello, Min. Hello, Mahakala. Hope everyone is very, very well. It's fantastic to have you joining me today. And I haven't been on this channel for a little while, but most of you had probably noted. It has been a very busy time, but it's also been an incredibly hot time. And it's been hard to get stuff done during the day. And I know I sound like just like a whinger, but you know, the UK really does shut down when it gets really hot. And then on top of that, last week I was away, so I literally just came back yesterday night. So I've been away for the week, and I'm back now. And yeah, it's nice to be online with you guys. Congratulations for DV, who just got accepted into college today, biomedical science. Come on. And you got a job too. You're eating. You're eating. You know what? I think that's a foghorn sound. Let me just quickly just check that. Should have been like a wheel up. Yeah, there you go. I'm just letting off some wheel ups for you. Shout out for DV. I am very, very happy. I am very happy. That is amazing news. That's what we want to hear. We want to see that. We want to see people in the community moving forward, especially those who have their heads screwed on correctly. It's one thing for us as, you know, black people, Africans, etc., all across the world or in Africa to progress. But I think personally it's in an entirely different thing when people who are about it see progress, because those who are about it, and you know what I mean when I say about it, I would use the word woke if they hadn't bastardized and ruined it so much. But when those who are about it see progress, they tend to bring the community with them. And I'm not talking about handouts, I'm not talking about charity, but that's also, I think that more falls in line with knowing that you're a part, you know, you're an integral part of a fabric. You know, you're not an isolated individual who's just self-seeking, but you know that you're part of this wider, broader community. It's common sense to think about your kids and to think about your family and to think that your progresses them. So I'm extra happy. I'm happy for everybody who makes progress in their life, but I reserve a little bit of extra happiness when people whose heads are screwed on correctly make progress. It's fantastic. So you have all blessings and all of my best wishes, and I can't wait to see what you do with your life. Thank you very much for sharing that with the community. You've uplifted us all, which is great. Yeah, so everyone needs a bit of uplifting. If you had met me last week, I needed a bit of uplifting. I wouldn't say I'm completely out of the mire, because at the moment in the UK we find ourselves at the center of a bit of a storm where the world, I will say the world, is against black academia in the UK, or black academics in the UK. They've fallen for the Kool-Aid that is the Jason Arde story and the demonization of Jason Arde, and they're using it as an opportunity to not only attack him as an individual who was a very good man and a very well-educated man, and to undermine what he accomplished, they're using that to attack black academics as a whole. So we are feeling the brunt of slander, basically, slander that goes against the reality of our existence here in the UK, being that everybody who's progressed in academia or in the professional world has worked exponentially harder than everybody else. And we're having that narrative flipped around to say that we just sneak in easily. Now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the whole Dr. Ade story. If you want to know more about that, I do talk about it a little bit more on my other channel, the King Mono Show. But I don't want to talk about that today. But I just want to let you know that that had the impact and the effect of, it's been weighing very heavily on me, knowing people who personally, myself and people who've been personally affected by this, is a lot to deal with. And I think at the moment we are under attack as Black people globally. We really are under attack. I couldn't have imagined I couldn't have imagined a presidency worse than the Trump one, which is ironic because I did not. I put my hand up. I did not see it coming. I thought Trump was just. I actually thought he was marginally better than other American presidents until this recent term. So yeah, egg on my face. And I admit I made a massive error in judgment there. Not that I get too involved in politics, but my God, it is hard right now. It is hard right now. You have to be a soldier if you're Black. You have to be a soldier or just have your blinkers on, essentially, because we are in the midst of what seems to be a very upscaled attack. Yeah, and I agree. We've been under attack for I wouldn't go as far as say 2,000 years, but Macy, I get your point. We've definitely been under attack for a long period of time, and actually, you could argue 2,000 years, depending how you're arguing this. If you take it out of being racial and you make it more of a geographic thing, then yes, we have been under attack for the last 2,000 years. So actually, you are correct there. But I'd say the intensification of this attack in the last year and a half, 2 years has been. Yeah, it's been hard to quantify. It's been hard to quantify. But anyway, that's an aside. Let's get into this video because I'm sure many of you did not come here to hear me harp on. You saw a very hopefully juicy thumbnail, and we're gonna watch a video together. And that's about the excellent Dr. Keita, who was interviewed on a channel called PK, which I'm not gonna go into that channel too much. Those of you who know me know I have got no love lost for the individuals who own that channel, but I have to give them credit and commend them for making this interview live, because it didn't reflect well on them or their intentions, but they made it live anyway, and I do have a degree of respect for that. I promised in another Discord group, the one that actually initially shared this with me, I promised that I wouldn't drag the channel owners. Okay, the people who own that channel, I promised I wouldn't drag them. I was not going to use this as an opportunity to drag them. So I'm not. I could have. You guys know me and my sarcasm and my sense of humor and how I love to drag idiots. And I'm not going to do it this time round. Just because I made the promise, I was like, look, I'm not going to drag them. They posted this. They didn't have to post it. So I'm not going to drag them. I'm going to commend them for putting it up there. That said, am I going to critique them as we watch this video? Yes. But I think our greater focus needs to be on how brilliantly Dr. Keita navigated this interview, because this interview was essentially a minefield of very loaded questions, and it was conducted, I would say, in a very unprofessional way, but that's an aside, I'm not dragging. This interview was conducted in a very unprofessional way to try to lead Dr. Keita to say certain things against the Black community, against Black scholarship, against Afrocentrism, and he never fell for the bait once. He expertly and seamlessly navigated their very bizarre anti-Black rhetoric, because, by the way, spoiler alert, if you don't know the channel I'm talking about, I'm going to play it in a minute, they're all Black. They're a bunch of Black people. I can't call them scholars because they're not scholars. They're not, none of them are academics, but a bunch of Black people who parrot the most racist, anti-Black academic theories and purport them to be true for some weird reason. So they're like the Officer Tatums of, I can't even call it scholarship because they didn't do that. They're like the Officer Tatums of online discourse about history. Let's say that. Yeah. So they're the officers of online discourse about history, where they just try and find the most anti-black negative things and then act like that's the most scientific thing. So they kind of align things being scientific and correct with how racist they are. So they think there's a positive correlation with anti-black sentiment and truth. It's a bizarre thing, guys. You're gonna see it for yourself. I don't want to kind of like preface it too much. You're gonna see it for yourself. It's the most bizarre thing to behold. They literally hate any kind of scholarship that is complimentary towards black people, and it's the weirdest thing. So they've managed to get Dr. Keita on the channel, which was a feat in itself, because I've been trying for a long time and I haven't managed to succeed. So I commend them for that. And I put my hands together for them posting this interview up, because this used to be behind a paywall as well. So first of all, congratulations and thank you to them for doing that. But that doesn't change my critique, just like my, just like, Bantu City Diaries doing one positive video doesn't change my perception on him. It doesn't change my critique. This is not, I don't think they're good people. That's my bottom line. I don't think they're good people. I think they're quite, I think they operate in horrible faith. I would say bad faith, but in horrible faith against anything that seems progressive for black people. And I don't get it. I don't get it. Anyway, I quit trying to pathologize. It's not my position to do that. Let's get into the meat and bones of this video. Let's let Dr. Keita talk for himself. There is going to be a lot of playing back, but I think there's a lot of value in what Dr. Keita brings. And so as much as I normally want to, and I normally jump in every few seconds to give critique, I am going to let some of this play out. Now, I know this is going to leave me, I'm going to say, vulnerable or exposed to a copyright claim. And to be honest with you, if, I wouldn't put it past them to put a copyright claim against me showing this video, because, we're not, politically, morally, ethically, academically aligned in any way, shape or form. We literally are diametric opposites to each other in terms of our outlooks. So it's absolutely fine. But that being said, let's kind of see how it goes. I am treating this as a fair use response, because I am going to be reacting to it in real time. This is not just an opportunity to replay their content. And I'm going to be speeding up to play a little bit faster. But I still think there's more value in you hearing more of Dr. Keita's words than my own. So this might play out a little bit longer than I normally do. Okay, so that's enough of the preamble, guys. Thank you for joining me. We are 13 minutes in, and I think we can dive straight in to this video. Yeah, let's go. Let's go. Okay, so for those of you who are still wondering or questioning what this video is, it's called Interview with the Experts. Dr. Shamaka, I always say his name wrong, Dr. Shamaka Keita, Biological Affinity of the Ancient Egyptians. Now, the interesting thing about this interview, which you guys are going to know from the start, is the host prepared the slides for the slideshow and then got the person he was interviewing to progress through the slides. Once again, I've spoken already about how unprofessional I think that is. Why not let him come along with his own slides and his own talking points? And if you're gonna ask questions, then why didn't you present and ask questions? This is, like I said, I think there's an underlying current of disrespect in the way this entire interview is conducted, and I will pick it out as I go through. But I'm sure you'll pick it up for yourself. But that being said, we're here now, and I'm gonna let it play, and let's get cracking. Oh, by the way, hit a 1 if you can hear it playing when it hits play. If there's any issues, let me know, okay? Or hit a 2. You know the deal.
Okay, that's what it is. So let's get right to it. Real fast though, Sister Tiffany, I'm going to see a thing and actually there's a lot of Mr. Bioanthropology have these real Keita.
By the way, I'm just skipping, okay, just respectfully. Yeah, I'm skipping through. But let me know if you heard it playing just then.
It's very, very. We need see the is some combo right now in 2020. Can you bring up the slide? We can get right. I'm gonna get that.
Give me a second. Oh, my day was fine. Cool here, basically.
I'm born and raised So that's a deep football African jet. There's some kind of allow you too. So we have prepared for you.
Okay, excellent. All right, so we are there now, guys. Okay, we're there now. I had to do a bit of skipping. Someone's recognized the voice already. Yes, it's unfortunate, but the person to the left, okay, this is the man we need to be paying attention to. Dr. Shamaka Keita. He is an unbelievable academic and an unbelievable mind, and I already had immense respect for him. So I'm laughing at the comments. I already had immense respect for him, but seeing how he navigated such a bad faith interview, I was like, okay, respect levels have actually just gone through the roof. This guy is as sharp as a tack. There's no getting around him. He literally picks up on every single nuance. But quick shout out to Crenshaw Grinder. Thank you very much for your $5 donation. He said these people are collaborators. Indeed. There's a lot to be said about these people. I'm going to try not to focus on them too much, and I'm going to try and let Dr. Keita show you how to deal with such bad intentioned or such bad actors. Let's go.
Or actually, hopefully, kind of.
By the way, I'm going to just speed this up, okay? Because this is a long interview, as you can see, it's over 3 hours, and we're not going to make any progress if we listen to a normal speed. But I think it's just about okay. Playing it back fast. I did that last night, and it was okay.
Tease out the information so to make it palatable for the community. And I really appreciate you. So it's the interviews with the experts, okay? And we got the great Dr. Keita. And go ahead, Sister Tiff, you can change the slide. Let's go. So we're going to do with genetics, history, and Egypt. Dr. Keita speaks.
So they're, once again, like I said to you, they've set up their own presentation here, which I find bizarre. I don't understand why you do that. You either do a live interview or you let your guest present. You don't do a presentation and say, can you work your way through my slides? That's anyway.
Section 1, genetics in ancient Egypt. This is a hot topic in our community. So my first question is, what can DNA really tell us about the origins of the ancient Egyptians? Go ahead, Dr. Keita.
Well, the first thing to understand is that the word origins itself can be very problematic. If it just means beginnings, that's one thing. But if it's supposed to be a beginning that explains something, that's something else. So in terms of population, in terms of the actual people there, what genetics could tell us, if you had all of the data, is that it could tell us something about the earliest layers of population in that area. And depending on what time period you have.
Someone's asked me to turn them up a bit. I'm not sure how possible that's going to be. The one thing I might be able to do or might need to do is turn my mic down a bit if there's a bit too much contrast, because I have a feeling this is already up, at the max. Wait. My volume's always up at the max. Yeah, that's up at the max already. So what I'm going to do, guys, I'm going to turn my mic down a bit. Okay, so my mic's down a bit, and hopefully that will reduce the contrast. That will allow you to turn your volume up without getting too much of a boom. But that's all I can do. Let me know if that works. Okay, I've turned my mic down a bit now, and that allows you to then turn your system up a little bit more, because my mic is very, very loud. Well, thanks for the feedback there. And actually, whilst I've got it paused, I'll just jump in as well, because my instant reaction to that question as well is, what can genetics tell us about the origins of the ancient Egyptians? And straight away, my mind cast to the word origins, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what do you mean by origins? Because people put a lot of faith in genetics being able to tell you about the origins of anyone. But in order for genetics to be able to tell you about origins, you need to have a massive comparative sample set of a snapshot in time, which we don't have, and we will never have, because ancient DNA is too sparse. We have like literally a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of any moment in time. We literally have an infinitesimally small amount of DNA the further we go back. So an individual taking, let's say, pick a random year. Let's pick a random year like a 3000 BC. If we got like 10 samples from 3000 BC, what does that tell us about that time frame? Almost nothing. It tells us almost nothing about that time frame unless we have, you know, a massive spread of different genetic data, you know, of that same time frame or that same point in time. If you don't have that, what you then have to draw your conclusions from is descent. Okay, you have to draw your conclusions from what do modern people's DNA look like and who do they descend from, and you almost can't get any of that data. You have no impact, or so you have no, yeah, you have no contribution or impact as to how your DNA spreads in the future. You don't know who your kids are going to sleep with and who their kids are going to sleep with and who their, and so on, so on, so on. Okay, your DNA just spreads, and it could spread throughout the whole world, you know, in, you know, 6 or 7 generations. You could literally be on every single continent. And so people thinking that you're going to learn the origins of a person because you've got their DNA is a ridiculous notion. It's a completely ridiculous notion. It's an impossibility. It's working backwards. Finding that someone has a bunch of white ancestors and a bunch of black ancestors and a bunch of Chinese ancestors tells you absolutely nothing about that individual. So this is one of the problems that you have. People put too much kind of like onus on the hope that DNA is going to explain something about origins, and it's not, because we don't have anything before the oldest DNA to know where did it come from, where did it originate. Okay, so that's an important thing, but I think he explains it better.
DNA from, as I said, if you have it from the 30th dynasty, it may tell you something about that time period. It might be better to think in turn, ask the question, what can biology tell us? So if we look at biology writ large, meaning skeletons as well as molecular biology, you may get also another kind of information from that. And sometimes these things may not run in sync. And remember that populations have blended and fused across the face of the earth for quite a long time. And in the case of Egypt, though, we have evidence, hard evidence of people being there from a time that goes back before, for the most part, we would say that modern people had left Africa. So if modern people evolved in Africa 180,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, it depends on who you talk to. And if they only left 70,000 years ago, or started leaving at that time, or 60,000 years, once again, and these confidence intervals, these large, these estimates have a large range of potential variation. Then we see that, for example, in Egypt, we have skeletal remains from 55 to 60,000 years ago. We have some more from 30,000 years ago. That's Nazca Khader, 35,000 years ago. We have things from places like Wadi Kubaniya and Jebel Sahaba in the late Paleolithic, around 17,000, 18,000 years ago. And then we have material from in between, but notably the beginning of the Neolithic and the pre-dynastic. So when you talk about DNA, we don't have a lot of DNA from, in fact, I don't know of any DNA from the earliest periods. But now let's imagine that we did have DNA. The question would be, can we properly ascertain the geographical origin of that DNA? Now, let me give you an example. The limb ratios of Cro-Magnon in Europe indicate a deep tropical origin, relatively speaking. But the DNA that you pull from Cro-Magnon bones is not the same group of haplotypes. Let's talk about lineages that you find in living Africans. But the limb ratios, which were retained, the tropical body tells you, along with other evidence, archaeology, common sense, let us say, tells you that they came from a tropical place. And the fossil record that we have in Africa, along with the other evidence that we have about DNA on living people, it tells us that, or the best conclusion, or is most consistent with there having been an African origin of modern.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause in there because he gave a lot of really important and detailed answers there. But you'll notice he was asked the question about genetics, and the first thing that he jumped to is to say, essentially, genetics can't tell us much. Okay, it's very hard to draw conclusions from genetics. But he said, to substantiate that, or at least to make that answer a bit stronger, he said, what we do have is we have people's biological remains and we have their limb proportions. Okay, he leaned on limb proportions, he leaned straight into their biological affinities and which populations those biological affinities are consistent with. And he's essentially saying, if you want to know about these ancient people, we don't have enough data regarding their DNA to say they're from X, Y, and Z. okay, because we don't have DNA that tracks back far enough for us to assert someone was from a certain place because they carry a certain marker. But what we can tell you, and gave the example of Cro-Magnon man, is that these are people that are physiognomically consistent with Africans, physiognomically consistent with modern Africans. These are tropically adapted people. So irrespective of which markers or who may have inherited their markers later down the line. So remember, I spoke earlier about the fact that when you're African, you have to understand as Africans, everybody's inherited our markers. Yeah. So no one really has unique markers. Okay. Everyone's inherited their markers from Africa. Okay. If you've got to believe in out of Africa theory. But the point of the matter that he's pushing is at a certain moment in time, what were these people regarded? And you could say quite easily, if you look at these people physiognomically, the ones that you've mentioned, they are aligned with Africans. Okay. They are physically consistent with Africans. They have the limb proportions of Africans. They have the features and the skull shapes of Africans. They looked like us. So that's the kind of answer he's trying to put through, and he's trying to also help people to understand that when you put too much emphasis on trying to prove the ethnicity or the group that ancestors belong to by the genetic signals possessed in descendant populations, that's doing backward logic. It doesn't work that way. Okay, it doesn't work that way. Genetics do not work that way. Population genetics shouldn't work that way. Okay, and I've explained this on multiple live streams before, but there you go.
Modern people. In terms of Egypt specifically, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about the ancient DNA study that I think a lot of people know about. You'd have to have ancient DNA from the earliest periods from all over the country to get a feeling for what came together in the country. Most importantly, though, it is local people there who synthesize, in a broad sense, the culture. Ancient Egyptian culture did not develop somewhere else and get brought into ancient Egypt. That's the most important thing to understand.
Okay.
The Africanity of Egypt is because the Nile Valley is this place of emergence. And various elements that went into that we can speak about later.
Okay.
So to be clear there, before they move on, he's making it clear here that the culture of the ancient Egyptians didn't evolve, or the ancient Kemetic people, or the ancient Tawians, or even Tatar, like I like to call them, the ancient Tatars. He's making it clear that the culture of these ancient peoples did not come from elsewhere. It evolved in situ, and it was a reflection of surrounding African populations. Now, we on this channel know this because we talk about cultural continuity constantly. This isn't a population that had to inherit or had to borrow ideas from elsewhere. Everything they do, most of the things they do are still done on the African continent. Most of the things they do are reflected in African culture, or were reflected in their neighbors. There was not some big cultural divide or big cultural leap when you traveled from Kemet to Kush. Yeah, you had a continuous cultural line. In fact, most people said that there was no kind of like border as such as we kind of like distinguish a border today. This is something that was this is something that has been kind of like anachronistically applied to the ancient Egyptian timeline by modern Egyptologists to say, here is the border. But actually, historically, it's kind of like you just had a land that merged from Kemet into Kush, and a people and a language, and you even saw surnames as they, would basically diffuse between being Meroitic, Cushitic surnames to being Kemetic surnames. And it was just like a melee of overlap in between. This was a contiguous culture, and this was reflected. This has always been reflected in the archaeology, and it's always been reflected in the biology of these people. The only people that have a problem with it are the people who have a problem with the ancient Egyptian or the ancient Kemetic culture being an African culture.
Emergence is what makes it African in terms of the culture, but the DNA doesn't tell you for real in any sense who made a particular pot, or who designed a particular type of stone tool, or who did this or that. And the DNA can't tell you who did it. And these things are not based on DNA. Culture, biology, and culture are two separate things. You can learn any language that you want to, or that you put in the environment of, and that's an important thing. And people can learn your language. So I'll just
okay.
that. Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate you. Put the slide back up, Ms. Tiff. Appreciate you. I appreciate that answer. A lot of times we get that confused. And all right, all right. So how should we interpret DNA studies that suggest the Egyptian ancestry is either European or African? How should we deal with that?
Now, I want you to notice the question here, guys. I want you to notice the question here. So remember what I said about leading questions, the questions asked or argued in bad faith? This is a question that I would expect someone to maybe have posed in the 19th century. Maybe someone who was contemporary to, Samuel Morton or Flinders Petrie, one of those. This is the kind of questions, Borchardt, these are the kind of questions that they would ask. How should we interpret DNA studies that suggest Egyptian ancestry is either European or African? Who says that? Respectfully, who the hell says it's either European or African? That's never been a question. Okay. At a stretch, people would say it's Levantine, which people would quote unquote say is Eurasian, okay, or has Levantine contribution. But this idea that it's either European or African, this is a loaded question to make it seem like this is some kind of a binary argument that takes place. Were the Egyptians Europeans or were they Africans? No one's argued that for at least 150 years. No serious Egyptologist has even sought to, address this kind of argument. But this is the kind of questions that you're going to see are frequent in this interview. But let me let Dr. Keita speak for himself.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. I don't know studies that if you look at all of the DNA studies that have been done on modern and earlier Egyptian studies, all of the biological studies, all of the genetic type studies. Now, genetic studies are mirror DNA. You have genetic studies on the serogenetics of living people, but you had some on mummies that were done a long time ago. You have people have pulled sickle cell anemia, evidence for sickle cell anemia out of one mummy that I know about, early proto-dynastic remains. In terms of ancient DNA, we know about the Schwannemann study. I don't know. I hear that there are going to be some more ancient DNA studies that are done. But now, if we look at the living population of Egypt, and let's focus on just one particular type of DNA, Y chromosome.
So before he gets into the modern population of Egypt, and it's important to note that even the kind of like the modern studies that people refer to, they're not very, very supportive of this notion of widespread European contribution. Obviously, the most famous one would be the Schwannemann study, which, I don't think is worth arguing, against that one too much, because the population just wasn't ancient Kemetic population. It was literally the done in a tomb that was in a region that hadn't been settled by the ancient Kemetic people since the Middle Kingdom. So since the second intermediary period, it had been a foreigner's tomb, and it was one that the Greeks then took over, which the place that we know as the Fayum, which is where they took the samples. And obviously I did my recent live stream and talked about the fact that they just had skulls that were collected 1,000 years ago. 100 years ago. It wasn't even like they were like carefully curated samples. But that's an aside. So we've got that study. Then we have more recently the Nurat-Man study. And the Nurat-Man study, for all intents and purposes, in spite of the best efforts to skew this data towards Europeans and Asians, came out with 80% African and 20% Levantine. So even the Nurat study came out with a majority African result. Now, there's lots to read into how they conducted that study and the kind of racial implications of admitting that they were closer to Northwest Africans than they were to anybody else. I'm not going to go into that right now, but that's, we could talk about QPADM and the false, the kind of false reference sets that they used, which were only going to give a certain answer. But the bottom line is we still have an 80-20 African leaning. And in spite of the best efforts to skew data towards Europe and Eurasia, these tests still keep coming back, suggesting that the ancient Egyptians were a native African population. Now, we can talk about, obviously, DNA tribes. We could talk about the Jourdain study, which Keita was a part of. We could talk about Ramesses III's Y lineage haplotype. We could talk about lots of different things feeding into the fact that they were a very African population. So, like I said, the premise of the question was incorrect. That's one of the big problems that we have. The premise of this question was incorrect. It shows, in my view, a little bit of unfamiliarity perhaps with the actual source material to suggest that there's been studies that have come back and said DNA, ancient Egyptians have European DNA. I think the only argument they even try to pose with that is the, R1b, King Tut having R1b. Now, King Tut being one of the most African of all, ancient Egyptian samples ever, if you look at his autosomal DNA, which had massive affinities with Central and Southern Africa, and his actual skeletal proportions being completely black and the skin being completely black and everything about him being completely native African. And then his R1b lineage being something that has been present and dominant on the African continent for at least the past 20,000 years. All of these things, okay, all of these things load into the R1b being a native R1b, and perhaps the phylogeny of the kind of like the way they've worked out which haplotypes descend from another, and perhaps needing some revision, which is something that I've said for a long time now, because these population geneticists are a bit quacky. But that's an aside. Let's carry on.
DNA from the male specific region of DNA. When you look at that, you see a population, yes, that's mixed, but you see a core population clearly that is rooted there in northeastern Africa, and we know that those lineages emerge in northeastern Africa, so we don't have to think twice about that. By the time you get to today in Egypt, or for that matter, even maybe 2,000 years ago, we have to remember how old Egypt is and where it is. We have a population that has a lot of different elements in it, and that does not change one bit the origins of the culture. Let's do a little comparison here. And most of the audience here knows about the pre-dynastic of Egypt, which is where the basis of Egyptian culture is. And before that, you have to talk about hunters on the Nile River, and you have to talk about pastoralists from the Sahara.
And it's really important just to I'm going to let him finish, but it's really important to drive home this. One of the things I always say to people is that genealogy trumps genetics. And a lot of people don't understand what I'm getting at when I say this. Who you are genetically when you're growing up, particularly historically when we didn't even know what genetics were, is largely irrelevant. Your genetics is largely irrelevant. What's important is your genealogy, because your genealogy encapsulates your culture. And one of the examples I gave is for instance, I'm a Yoruba. I've been raised a Yoruba. Now, genetically, I haven't been tested, but let's say in theory, I got myself tested and it came up that genetically I was like 70 or 80% Igbo and only 30% or 20% Yoruba. Does that change the fact that I've been born and raised a Yoruba and that I've considered myself a Yoruba culturally my whole life? No, it doesn't. I'm still a Yoruba man. We don't know how that happened. I'm not saying this happened, but I'm saying let's say that it can be traced back to, 7 or 8 generations down the line, there being a huge migration of Igbo people who then converted to being Yorubas, and I've got many of them in my lineage. I'm a Yoruba. It's irrespective. I'm a Yoruba. I've been raised a Yoruba. And I think these efforts to kind of like put labels upon certain markers or put labels upon certain clusters and say this belongs to this tribe, it's pseudoscientific. That's what people don't realize. Culture, as Dr. Keita is explaining here, trumps genetics. Genealogy trumps genetics. Always. Okay? What people are is what they are, is what they will raise. It's the culture that they embrace. It's not the genetic lineage that they come from. And I think people really have a hard time kind of understanding this, but that is kind of where it goes. That's how it works. You are the culture that you absorb. I am a Yoruba person. It doesn't matter what my genetics down the line might come back and say, oh, I had a few ancestors from here, there, and everywhere. But the bottom line is I'm a Yoruba. Every accomplishment that I kind of achieve in my life and anything that I've sow towards will be the Yoruba lineage will be a part of that story. Not these kind of like random, oh yeah, you got 6% Mandi and 4% this and 3%. That's irrelevant to my tale. Okay, so that's one of the things that I think is quite important for us to understand.
These things merge in the Nile Valley. For example, when you look at Badarian pottery, it has black top, which everybody probably is familiar with, and it has a rippled finish. Well, the earliest rippled pottery in Africa comes from the Sudan, and the earliest black top pottery comes from the western desert of Egypt. In the Badarian pottery, we see a synthesis of these two ideas in terms of ceramics. if you want to use ceramics as some sort of a marker. And I think you can. You don't find Bedarian pottery in Palestine, in India, in Norway, or in Miami. You know, you find it in El Badari and southern in middle to southern Egypt.
So he's speaking there to the uniqueness of the arts that you find in ancient Kemet as well. Once again, and he's just talked about pottery there, but we could extend that to the architecture used in ancient Kemet. We could extend that to the clothing used in ancient Kemet. We could extend it to the hairstyles used in ancient Kemet. We could extend it to the burial traditions used in ancient Kemet. We could extend it to the use of headrests used in ancient Kemet. There are so many things in ancient Kemet that are only practiced and only reflected in other African societies and cannot even be found. Not even a single example can be found outside of the African continent. That's how African the ancient Kemetic society was. So I'm glad that he just extended on that one example, because it gives so much to the discussion that's being had here.
So I think that's the most important thing to understand. When you look at the modern population, you see a wide range of genetic variation and with a plurality that in terms of Y chromosome, a plurality to 50% that clearly is African in origin. So the Y chromosome, you find a bit of haplogroup A, a bit of haplogroup B, mainly haplogroup E, but you find other things that came in because you're looking at the modern population. And Egypt is at the crossroads. Again, though, I want to emphasize that when you look at the early, and I'll probably be repeating myself, when you look at the emergence of the pre-dynastic culture of Egypt, what you see is that initial synthesis of Saharans and people on the Nile. When it comes to domesticated animals, you know, we have sheep and goat and wheat and barley. These are the Near Eastern domesticates. These do become a part of Egyptian life, but they are adopted on terms of the local people, and they actually are incorporated initially into a foraging strategy. The Neolithic, the food production in the classic sense that it's often talked about, is essentially 2,000 years earlier in the Levant, in Palestine. It's essentially 2,000 years earlier. So for those who would like to tell you that, oh, the ancient Egyptians came from Palestine and they swarmed over the valley, well, that's not true. That's not true. If it were true, the ancient Egyptians would have been speaking Semitic, because the earliest farmers, when we do analyses on pre-Proto-Semitic, when you do an analysis of early Semitic, common Semitic, you find the agricultural terms there. And we know that those sites dates to what, 8,000 BP or whatever. So they're earlier than the Bedarian. They're earlier even than the Neolithic in northern Egypt. Now, that Neolithic in northern Egypt had some influence from other places. But like I said, those animals and wheat and barley were adapted into a foraging strategy, the strategy of living that was developed along the Nile. That's the most important thing to understand by local people. Okay, they incorporated it on their own terms. They transformed themselves. They made themselves. So they had agency. Important concept to understand. But
so that's interesting, because he speaks there about the aspects of culture, or at least I should say kind of subsistence, that were inherited from what we classify as the Middle East now and the Semitic speaking regions. There's a whole line of discussion that we need to have about the Semitic languages, because those are African languages anyway, and the Semitic speaking cultures are much more closely related to the Niger Congo speakers than people would have you believe. And that's a whole nother study that I can't wait to start to release to you guys, some work that I've been doing behind the scenes there. But the point being, he's saying that there's evidence that there are some aspects of kind of agriculture that are more unique to those regions, but were being practiced a long time ago there. And yet we don't see the infusion of those Semitic words. What we see an infusion of in ancient Kemet is a later adaptation to some of those kind of agricultural trends like wheat and barley he mentioned there. And they then integrated that, into their kind of like lifestyle, their subsistence lifestyle, and they adapted it to work in Kemet. And it came later, but it didn't come with any kind of like widespread influence. So it was just kind of like the receipt of a crop, kind of in isolation of anything else. So that's really interesting, because he broke that down really clearly. So that was very interesting to hear.
another interesting thing, and actually I will have answered, I'm answering some things that I think you'll probably talk to me about later on. What's
Okay.
interesting though is that the words in ancient Egyptian, although the wheat and the barley came from the Levant, came from Southwest Asia, or what we call Southwest Asia, and there's no reason why we couldn't call it extended Northeast Africa, but that's a whole nother conversation, right? That's an arbitrary division that other people made. We don't have to make it, but you know, accepting that. But in any
And by the way, I agree with you, Definity. He's talked about the fact that the cattle domestication in Africa has got nothing to do with Asia. And I would stand on that. We had very long-standing cattle domestication. Also, we have a unique form of cattle, which I speak about all the time. Okay, so the unique breed of cattle that was farmed by the ancient Kemetic people is an African cattle. It was domesticated in Africa, and it has nothing to do with European or Eurasian cattle breeds, and it goes back several thousands of years, and there's no evidence to suggest that that was inherited or that was passed in. So that was important that you've actually mentioned that as well. So I think what he's talking about here is just restricted to the agriculture of certain plants that were then infused into the Kemetic lifestyle, and he's mentioned specifically here wheat and barley, which sounds very plausible to me.
case, the words for the wheat, the barley, the sheep, and the goat in Egyptian, I mean, in ancient Egyptian, not what we call loan words. They're not borrowed. Okay, so that means they're Egyptian terms. So that means that they had animals that they were working with, the plants they were working with, and experimenting with. That when they incorporated these foreign things, they already had a name for them because they already had something like it. They weren't doing the same thing. Domestication is a technical term,
and to be clear there, so he's made it clear that for sheep, goat, cattle, Africans had their own terms. The ancient Kemetic people had their own terminology, and they didn't borrow, or they didn't diffuse, so to speak, the terms that came from outside. Now, what's really interesting about that is I'm doing a lot of work in linguistics at the moment, and the number of terms that are used in Indo-European languages that were definitely directly inherited from Africa is exponentially large. They've tried their best to hide these, but I think as the reality of how much of the modern kind of Indo-European tongue came directly from Africa starts to come to light, it's gonna bring a really challenging set of circumstances to modern academicians in that field. They are going to have to answer with kind of like fidelity as to why they are using so many African terms if Africa was this alleged dark continent, or Africa didn't have this kind of influence over those regions. It's really interesting because this is one of the topics that has caused me to kind of, I've been going through this on the academy with a few people. That's the membership site that we have, with a few people in my group, and one of the members there, Jake, has forced me to pick up Black Athena again, which is a book I kind of didn't read it cover to cover, but kind of breezed through as a reference book a long time ago. But now I need to pick it up and read through it in detail because there's a lot of stuff that's really relevant there. But yeah, I just thought I'd share that. It's very, very interesting how much words on the European, or I hate the word Eurasia, but let's just use it for this time, Eurasian landmass were actually borrowed from Africa. It's amazing. And with those words, by the way, come technologies as well. So it's not just isolated words, it's words that relate to certain technologies such as metallurgy, all of which will be revealed shortly.
It basically means that you have more or less complete control over something. So in the case of animals, you know, they were herding Saharan cattle. Now, new data, new information says that Fred Windorf, who thought that African cattle were domesticated, they're now saying that they don't buy his thesis for the Western desert. But those cattle were being walked to different places, so they were being managed. But the distinction between managing something like penning sheep, Barbary sheep, which still are not domesticated today, is that you can manage them, but the difference, or the definition of something that's been domesticated, is that there's been a change in behavior. They need people, in other words, and that they have changed anatomically. Okay, they've changed anatomically. All right. So
yeah.
You know what's interesting about that definition is given to domestication. They're talking about the fact that they will change anatomically. In other words, they'll kind of evolve, or at least be bred to change, where there be a dependency on people, and they can't survive without kind of like human intervention. What's interesting about that is if you've watched the documentary I put together about, you know, the relationship between the Ankh and the cattle and the Ankara people, then one could argue that cattle domestication across Africa hasn't really occurred because, and wait, let me land with this. The reason I argue this is because the relationship between African shepherds and their kind of like cattle herds doesn't make the cattle completely dependent on human intervention. They still, in many ways and to many degrees, kind of like just manage these cattle herds. The cattle are allowed to live. You know, the interesting thing about this kind of like being known is you think about what's best for not only the people that are actually managing these herds, but also for lifestyle and for the herds themselves. This is what we call kind of like the organic free range lifestyle, isn't it? So are we having kind of like this argument or this discussion between something not being truly domesticated unless you've put it in a battery environment, you know, where they're just like walking around like zombies, like European cattle, just bumping into fences, overweight? Is that sustainable? Is that healthy? I would argue no. So it's kind of like, where do you draw that line of domestication? Because even to this day, if you come across the Ankara farmers, you know, the people, the Ankara farmers, I'm trying to think of the specific ethnic group in Uganda. It's not the Banyankore. I've already mentioned them. I'll remember it shortly. But if you come across those people, they, when they farm, it's not an overbearing form of farming, and it's not Titsy. Thank you for mentioning that, though, Liz. It's not an overbearing form of farming that creates these zombified creatures. They still remain largely kind of like independent. They even speak about the fact that they name each of their cattle, so they could have like a, you know, they could have a herd of, let's say, you know, 500 cattle, and they'll know each of them by name. So they'll know each of these cattle by name. That's the kind of relationship they have, but it's a very healthy relationship. And everything we know about, you know, large scale kind of like food production will tell you that's the most healthy way for you to have, so to speak, a relationship, or for us to have a relationship with our domesticated animals. And that, I'm not saying Dr. Kate is doing this, by the way, but I'd imagine a lot of Europeans and, you know, maybe even like Asian scholars, etc., might look down upon this and say, oh, these aren't truly domesticated because you haven't pumped them with you haven't pumped them with, you know, horse semen and and fed them until their ankles are buckling. It's like, no, because you want to preserve, so you want something that has longevity. And it's this big difference between the way Africans, in my view, have always treated their planet and their environment. And actually, I say Africans, but I'm going to say the Aboriginal species of the planet, the Aboriginal man of, you know, be it Native America, be it Australia, be it Native Asia, be it Native Europeans. The Aboriginal man had this idea of longevity, okay, which they would practice when it came to how they interact with nature, versus modern man, who's always after this kind of like maximized profit, short-term gain, maximum take, and they don't think about the kind of long-term damage that creates. So I know I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but my mind was going there when he talked about the true definition of domestication. It's kind of like, well, are there still kind of like pastoralists who haven't got fully domesticated, you know, cattle herds? And is that better? Isn't that what we should be aiming for? You know, it's just something that came to mind. Let me give a quick shout out to a donation that's just come through, a couple actually. Shout out to James Stewart. How you doing, sir? Thank you very much for your $5. He said, bro, you're about to smash the entire Indo-European myth. I am indeed. I'll be jumping on that academy to check that out. Appreciate that. Could do with your membership. Would be wonderful to have you there, because those meetings, I mean, as good as they are, I'd love to fill out the classroom one day with everybody on here who's about that life. So yeah, I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you there. Big shout out also to Raphael Akhenaten, thank you very much for your $20 donation, my brother. I appreciate it very much. You haven't left a comment, but I can see the big heart on the emoji. So yeah, shout out to you for that. Let's carry on.
We want to get to the next slide, but that piece about how the geography, very interesting changes.
Yeah, and I want to say something too. Sheikh Anta Diop, who we all appreciate for him reclaiming, recreating, or reminding people that Egypt is in Africa. Although there were Europeans that said this too, even before him. So it's not totally original. But because he did it in a very political time in a very specific way, reacting to the way the West had sort of disconnected Egypt, it comes across a certain way. But remember that Sheikh Anta Diop himself said, even though he used the term black to refer to the Egyptian population across all time and space, even he said that they had begun to absorb whites from the Levant. If you look at the book Black Nations and Culture, or the translated version of that and some other essays, African Origin of Civilization, he says very, very explicitly that the Egyptian population was black, but absorbed some whites who infiltrated during the Amrashan period. Well, if you know your prehistory, not prehistory, but if you know your early Egyptian pre-dynastic history, the Amrashan is now we call it Nakata 1, but it succeeds the Badarian. So very, very, very early on, even Sheikh Anta Diop is saying, I don't even necessarily know that I believe that, but anyway, he wrote that. So for those who are saying, well, Sheikh Anta Diop says one thing, he says this, read it very carefully. He's using a definition of black or a definition of African that's kind of like the way we use the definition of black here. There's no question from a cultural point of view that that this is true, that Egypt stays true to itself. Whenever things get in trouble, the original constitution that was...
Now, before he jumps into the next point, which I know is a very important point, and I want him to finish, it's interesting there that he mentioned Sheikh Anta Diop's theory that essentially ancient Kemet started infusing non-Africans, so we're going to use the word non-Africans to be non-controversial here, from as early as the pre-dynastic. So he's saying very, very early on, there are people who are coming from the outside and becoming a part, or at least having some kind of, for want of a better word, genetic impact on the ancient Kemetic population. That's Sheikh Anta Diop. And these are people who people would turn around and there'd be, they'd have this idea that there's, no flexibility, no room for anyone from the outside. But the reality is I guess the argument that's being made there, and this is what Dr. Keita said, he wasn't even sure if he even agreed with it. But he's saying the argument being made here is that, hey, look, Kemet has always sparked the interest of surrounding nations. They've always wanted to be a part of it. And whether or not that happened diplomatically or if it happened by some kind of invasion, people would find their way into Kemet's shores. And those of you who are kind of like biblically inclined will agree with us. Like, yeah, it's kind of like reminds us somewhat of the story of, Joseph, I think it was. And then, he going down there with his 12 brothers and then them becoming a nation from within Kemet. These things have always been happening. Outsiders, people coming from the outside and becoming a part of Kemet, or finding some kind of a city state where they can find some belonging, and that having an effect on the demographic. So it's very, very interesting that even the very best of our scholars have kind of acknowledged this.
Formulated in Dynasty 1, the whole value system around Ma'at, they always return to that, the so-called first intermediate period before the 12th dynasty. What happened? 12th dynasty, the kings reassert themselves, and they always come from the south. They always reassert themselves from the south. And then the second intermediate period, the 17th dynasty pharaoh or family, they come up from the south. Amhos and his folk, they're from Thebes, they're from the south, and they reassert. So it's almost like the south was a repository of the culture. Now, people don't write about it that way, and some people might take, say that's a simple way to say it, but it's still accurate based on the historical data. What that means, I'm not prepared to say, but you could imagine that the north was always in contact and was a little bit different than Middle Egypt in the south. And now
this is something that you don't have to wait for a scholar to tell you, but it's always good when a scholar reinforces the fact that Kemet's renaissances, so for want of a better word, always came from the south. Whenever they needed to restore, you'd find there'll be some kind of a movement from the south. The progress out of the first intermediary period into the Middle Kingdom was a southern restoration. The progress from the second intermediary period into the New Kingdom once again was a southern restoration. Often Thebite, sometimes kind of Middle Egypt, Harakapolitan, sometimes even parts, but always moving from the south. And then obviously we have the 25th dynasty, which was another restoration period, and that came from Kush itself. So we have these continual moves from the south that would restore Kemet from these kind of like outside invasions that used to happen. It's always from the south. There was never any question about that. You didn't see Kemet being restored from the north. I think that's the point that's being made here quite strongly. The strength of Kemet lay within Central Africa, you know, and it's really, really important to note that. So yeah, yeah, and shout out to everybody in the chat. Hope everyone's enjoying this. I like the fact that Wildflower just like, why are you shouting? They're like, but oh, pseudo killer here. What's going on? What's going on is we allow the scholar to speak for himself. Thank you very much. And to say that he doesn't subscribe to Black Egypt means you just don't understand him. Because for everyone who's been on this live stream for at least, you know, and heard the first 10-20 minutes of what he's been saying, I think there's no doubt whatsoever that he subscribes to a Black Egypt. So you probably need to just get your education up. But you know what? You're in the right place. If you want to be educated, this is the place for you to become educated and stop shouting about science that you don't understand. Let's carry on.
Even during the proto-dynastic period, during the period we would call Dynasty Zero, on the count of three, there were stations or trading stations, what have you, by the Egyptians in Canaan, in the Levant, in Southwest Asia, what we call the Near East. And anytime you have trading stations, the basis of trade and so forth, you created a basis for social relations. So no, one should not be surprised if the population takes on, assimilates other people, again, based on its own cultural mores, its own cultural values. I can stand that in contrast to ancient Carthage. Now, we like to talk about Hannibal. You know, Hannibal, fought the Romans, and we see him as a great African leader. And, you know, we've seen the gladiator movies, and, you know, they a mixed population along the coast of Northern Africa. That's accurate, meaning a population with varying phenotypes, skin colors, and what have you. But let's think about Carthage. Carthage started off as what? What did it start off at? A trading station. Now, I
will say that when it comes to, we do make a lot of assumptions, and this isn't just pointing at Dr. Keita here. I think this is the public in general. We make a lot of assumptions about phenotype based on kind of like our historical inheritance, which of these kind of histories that were fabricated largely during the 18th and 19th century, where ancient cultures were thoroughly whiteified. Ones that weren't white, ones that were mixed. So mixed cultures became white, Black cultures became mixed, etc., etc. And so what happens is we have a look at these ancient societies and we just have this kind of picture in our head and we say, oh, it was a mixture of this, that. I would argue quite strongly that I've seen very little evidence of modern Western European type whites being anywhere in the Mediterranean in this period in time. Okay, and when I say this period in time, I'm talking kind of like Bronze Age, yeah. I don't think there's any evidence for these kinds of Western European type whites being anywhere in the Mediterranean. I think they are a much later arrival that has done a very good job of writing themselves into history. I think that's what the history suggests, and I'm quite happy to kind of like stand on that hill, so to speak. But anyway, I'll let him carry on.
Made a mistake. I published an article on this where I call it a settler colony. That's crude political language and harsh, but it was probably that, or at least a trading station. That's how it started off, if we accept the high date in the 9th century or the 7th century for founding of Carthage. But what was it by the time you get down to 200 BC or 300 BC, and they're fighting or talking to the Romans, and much later on, are they still a Phoenician settler colony? I mean, they spoke a Semitic language. Their gods were all from the Levant, okay, in Carthage, but they were on African soil and had been there. In fact, up until, for a very long time.
By the way, there's a huge question mark about what the Phoenician language was. Once again, I'm going to lean on the fact that the Phoenician language as much as we think we know what it is, it's a language very closely related to modern Niger Congo languages. And there's a linguistic thread that proves this, and it's in the basically in the format of the consonants, the way they're arranged. And a lot of what we lean on is based on a false vowelization, and this is something that happens not just in ancient Phoenicia, it happens in all of the ancient languages, where historians look back, they don't know what the vowelization is, they don't really understand things like tonal languages, etc., and they just guess vowels and they throw them in. That's happened to a lot of languages from around this time in this region. So it's happened to the Semitic languages, it's happened to the ancient Phoenician languages, happened to the ancient Egyptian language. But there is a key to unlocking all of this that lies in Africa, and I look forward to that exercise becoming a little bit more, you guys being kind of that being revealed to you. I look forward to revealing the research, because it actually is very, very strong that these languages are a lot more closely connected to Africa than what we're being sold.
Sometimes they still call themselves sons of Tyre, Tyre, which was a place in Babylon, even though most of the people who would have been born in Carthage would have never actually have been there. And so you have the local Berber people, local Amazigh, and the question becomes, well, how much did they merge? And we know the population was highly heterogeneous, and I've even commented on that in a paper that I wrote a long time ago, analysis that I did. But for the other people that made the same observation, I used a different method. What I'm getting to is this: the populations of both Carthage and Egypt. Let's pick a date, 720 BC, 25th dynasty. In Carthage, you had people still speaking a Semitic language, with a mixed population, Semitic language, who probably had changed their outlook in terms of their cultural founders and biological founders. In terms of that, I don't know that they would have called themselves Phoenicians. We use the term Punic and what have you, but diverse population, but they were still practicing the culture from the Levant. In ancient Egypt, same date, they were still practicing the culture, population, which was heterogeneous, for the most part African, but now we have Kushite rulers in Egypt. And what are they doing? Practicing their most ancient culture that's local, a heterogeneous population, even with foreigners coming from outside of the Nile Valley and even outside of Africa, Syrians and what have you. They're still practicing the culture that grew up on the Nile. And whatever other changes were wrought by whomever got on the throne, they were still to their core Egyptian, perhaps until the Greco-Roman period. In Carthage, what was going on? They were practicing that religion and had those gods that had come from the Levant. But they were in Africa. So it gets to be very interesting about how you define people. So,
correct.
So we see Hannibal as a great hero. We call him that. I mean, we always have done that. I don't know how Hannibal looked. I do know that population was highly variable.
I think I'm going to lean on the fact that Hannibal looked like how he was depicted, or at least resembled how he was depicted on the coins that were contemporaneous with him. Contemporaneous being the key, not the ones that were created after or found later, but the ones that were contemporaneous with him, which showed him and his elephant on the other side. Clearly depicting that was a depiction of Hannibal, and this is how he was depicted, and he looked incredibly native African. Let's just use that phrase. He looked incredibly native African. Let me give a shout out to give me a second. James Stewart, thank you very much for your $5, sir. He said, people misunderstand Keita's position on Black Egypt. He doesn't use the term Negro, but he does believe in interior Black Egyptian. I mean, I think that goes without saying. Once again, you have to be listened to it. You have to be incredibly ignorant or incredibly kind of like wanting to hear something else to not understand Keita's position. I don't think I think without speaking for him, he probably finds the term Black unscientific, which it is. Okay, it's a modern racial construct. He understands that. And so he likes to argue with tools that can't be refuted. Tools that can't be refuted are culture. Tools that can't be refuted. And one of the things that he continuously refers to is biology. Yeah, limb proportions, how someone physically presents, irrespective of, fuzzy tools like genetics, which can be interpreted to say someone's from this region, that region, that region, and that region, depending on what you're prioritizing. King Tut being a perfect example. You've got a bunch of white Europeans who are convinced that King Tut was a blonde boy from Ireland because of his R1b lineage. And then you've got autosomal DNA saying that he has a 98.7% affinity with modern Central and Southern Africans. Okay. So once again, this is, regardless of which side of the fence you sit on, this is what you call fuzzy. Okay, this is fuzzy data, fuzzy logic that can be interpreted or analyzed a certain way. Things that are very hard to analyze against will be, you know, if you look at his limb proportions and they fall right slap bang in the middle of native black proportions. And then if you look at his skull shape and his occipital projection looking exactly like modern Africans in the region. If you look at his overjet, his overbite, and his subnasal prognathism, which are all three traits you don't really see outside of the African continent. If you see his his post-brigmatic depression in the middle of his skull, once again, this is something that is incredibly common, but incredibly rare out in Africa, but incredibly rare outside of Africa. He has an accumulation of traits that make him much more higher probability of being a native African than anything else. And I think those are the kind of verticals, those are the kinds of variables that Dr. Keita prefers to argue with. He doesn't like to argue with fuzzy logic and things that can be thrown out using semantics. He likes to argue with hard data. So I think this is why people struggle with the fact that he, of course, supports the fact that the ancient Kemetic people were black. Of course he does. But if you don't understand the points that he's raising, where he talks about biological and cultural affinities, and you don't understand what the cultural affinities are, you're going to think that he's saying something else, which is what often happens when people want him to say what they want him to say.
I don't know how Hannibal himself looked, but I know that Berber nationalists today, the Amazigh people, who regard themselves as the indigenous people of the region, who speak Berber as opposed to Arabic, for them, Hannibal is not a hero. Because he fought with local Berber rulers and people like Massinissa. Massinissa, even though some people have said this, I don't think it's...
Can I just say, the one thing that he doesn't touch on here, and I think I just have to throw it out there, is he talks about modern Berber. At least this is the kind of the idea that I got. I feel like he talks about modern Berber, modern Amazigh, as though they are native and ancient to the region, which is something that, if you guys know me, know that I push back against harshly, because I'm quite adamant about the fact that they descend from, or at least many of them are a result of the ongoing, frequent, and kind of like heavy, consistent inflow from the Black Sea slave trade. Okay. So we have, you know, lots of evidence suggesting this. We could look at Hannah Barker's work and research, even Dr. Nell Irvin Painter, who I think he mentions later in this interview, have all done extensive research about the Black Sea slave trade, about its origins being perhaps 1,000 years before Herodotus spoke about it first in 500 BC, and the fact that it wasn't concluded until after the transatlantic slave trade in 1865. So we have a 3,000-year span period of time where slaves were consistently being drafted from Central and Eastern Europe into Northern Africa, which is what has resulted in what we would classify as the modern people we classify as Amazigh people. Many of them are Europeans, a lot of them coming in the kind of later phase of this, you know, this slave trade, this Black Sea slave trade. But it's been written about extensively, and I think it's important that we acknowledge it. We don't just kind of like shelve it as, you know, as a possibility. It's a definite fact. It's been written about by multiple scholars. I've got a few documentaries on this channel about the Black Sea slave trade. It's indisputable, and it's better documented than in terms of the evidence we have for it, than the transatlantic slave trade. But that's just one of those things that's kind of like ignored. It's the reason we call Slavs. Okay, that's the reason why. And it was so recent, which is why they didn't change the name of, you know, slavery or slavery to something else. This is one of the reasons why, because it was present and it was continuous and it did take place. And that's the reason why I would put a asterisk against kind of like the classification of modern Berber / Amazigh people as being contiguous at least phenotypically, certainly, but culturally as well, with the ancient, or the ancients, as we're talking about the time of Hannibal, the ancient people of North Africa, even the ones who classified themselves as Berber, were not the same as the modern ones. Let me give a massive shout out to Raphael. Thank you very much, Mr. Akhenaten. Much appreciated. Your $50 is well appreciated. He said we need to focus on the Sahara. That region was once green, teeming with life. Black civilizations existed in that region. Absolutely. Drawings and the mummification of a Negroid toddler was found that literally outdates the oldest mummies in Kemet. Absolutely. And it was mummified, as I'm sure you knew when you wrote that. So yes, there is that. And here's the sad thing about the Green Sahara. Because of, and once again, you always find that Eurocentrism can be very reactionary to the kind of progress that we're making on this side of the discussion, so to speak. So I think people think that they don't take us seriously, but I think they take us incredibly seriously. And just like it took Sheikh Anta Diop doing his symposium in UNESCO symposium in 1974 for them to then coin and to overuse the word sub-Saharan, which has now become an unfortunate part of our lexicon. I think what you're finding now is this new attempt to reframe the Sahara, the ancient Sahara, or even I would even say the prehistoric Sahara, as being this mixed, this mixed utopia of kind of like it's absolutely ridiculous. The Green Sahara, we've always known it's existed, and it's always been Africa's homeland. It's always been a homeland for the modern, I think Sheikh Anta Diop would call it the tall, the modern tall races of Africa. That's the homeland, the Green Sahara. And now it's pathetic Europeans are trying to claim it as though this is kind of like their origin point, which is entirely ridiculous. It's got nothing to do with anyone that isn't African. And it's just, once again, we always have to constantly deal with this kind of like presentist view where these European descended people move into a region and then instantly classify themselves as being, they're longer than the Aboriginal people of that region. And so we're actually seeing this war now where, the irony of pale-skinned people trying to claim the Sahara as the origin point of their ancestry. You can see the ridiculousness of this argument, but this is what we have to face every time we make progress in terms of establishing our history and the footprints of our history. They go, oh, we like the sound of that. Oh, Green Sahara, that sounds cool. Oh, look at these lovely artifacts. Look at all this cool archaeology in this area. Yeah, we're from here, not you. This is the ridiculousness of what we're facing now. So there's now like been a shifting, and it's very recent, obviously, a very recent shifting of the goalposts now, where they're trying to claim large swaths of Africa. It's absolutely ridiculous, but this is what we're facing. Thank you very much, Raphael, for your very generous $50 donation. Shout out to you. Okay, let me just make sure I haven't missed any as well. Just want to make sure I didn't miss any. Yeah, I don't think I've missed any. Let's carry on.
It's been found in text, but his actions would say that he could have said, Master Nisa would have said Africa for the Africans. Okay. But anyway, I don't know that he said that. I made the mistake and not editing.
So 1 second, I'm just going to try expanding the making this video a bit bigger. No, I don't want to do the whole screen. Let's. No, I don't want that. Let me quickly. I want it in theater mode. Just give me 1 second, guys, as I quickly do this. I want it in theater mode. There. That's better. Okay. I'm a bit more happier with that. Let's carry on.
Something that I wrote where I basically put those words in my way. I meant to say that by his actions, he could have said that.
Okay.
But we have to always be honest in when we're doing our academic work and so forth. So
and hold on, but I appreciate that, and therein lies the problem that a part of being a bioanthropologist, part of being in academia, and part of being a scientist is the level of honesty, and I appreciate that. So let's move on to the next slide. We're going to deal with that Schulerman study. You kind of touched on it a little bit. I know there were some statements made, some apodictic statements the article say don't make apathetic statements on who the Egyptians are based off the paper, but a lot of people in the community did it. So why does studies based on late period DNA, like the 2017 Schuleman study, give a misleading picture of early Egyptian history?
Okay, now you've answered your question because it's a late period, and it's from the north, and it's from places as I published in a paper.
And it's interesting because I'm pretty much certain that the word misleading must have just been chucked in at the last minute, because I don't think I've heard anyone from this side of the fence argue that the Schuneman study was misleading. I think I've had a few debates with a few of them where they defend Schuneman study with their life, and it's actually taken channels like this and for discussions like us to actually surface the research and their refutations of Dr. Keita, which they've tried their best to bury. And obviously not giving a big shout out to myself, shout out to people like the Magi Archers, who have for a long time been surfacing the 2018 Jourdain and Keita study that was put together and thoroughly refuted the outcomes of the Schuneman study, for everyone to see that the 18th and 19th dynasty pharaonic lineages were far more closely, I wouldn't say we use the word related because I'm very careful how I interpret genetics, but had much closer affinity to modern African populations than they do to any Eurasian or even modern North African populations. So it just once again raised those important questions, and the point being that, you know, the host now is saying that study, why is that study misleading? But I don't think I've ever heard anyone from his side of the fence say it's misleading before. So it's just interesting that we're having a change of rhetoric here in the face of someone who they know is a very capable scholar who's capable of telling them why it's misleading, and they can't argue back. But anyway, let me let Dr. Keita respond. Sorry.
And it's also in a book too. It's from a place known to have been trafficked by people from the Near East, and then later on Greco-Romans. Okay, in fact, I think this area is near a reliquary with papyri that have Greek writing and stuff. I'm not sure. That's the latest period. Now, they did sample.
Can I just say really quickly, when I did I was one of the first people to do a kind of quite thorough documentary debunking the Schuneman study. And I remember when I first kind of like highlighted the fact, you know, the origin was, honestly, when I had raised this, there wasn't loads of people who had raised the argument about the fact that the actual Abu Sir al-Melek tomb, let's go into detail about that actual tomb. Let's not just say, oh, it's a foreign tomb. Let's actually go into detail about that tomb, and highlighted the fact that, you know, it was a foreign tomb, highlighted the fact that it was a part of the Fayum district, highlighted the fact that it was it didn't have, likely had no one that was native there, unless there were anything after Middle Kingdom would have been a foreigner. And then in the more recent study, highlighted the fact that these samples were all taken by German archaeologists over 100 years ago, and they were just literally skulls and kind of like half moth-eaten cadavers that had been sitting in German museums for 100 years. And obviously the kind of question marks about contamination, etc., are huge around that as well, but that's an aside. But the point being that a lot of these critiques that I raised, I remember getting a huge amount of kind of like know-it-alls after the fact coming saying, oh, you're wrong about this, you can't say this, you can't say that. And it's just lovely and vindicating to hear the fantastic and capable Dr. Keita saying exactly what was being argued from the start, because these people do not like being confronted with the truth. And someone like me, I'm easy to refute. I'm a YouTuber. Okay, I don't have PhD after my name, and so you can refute me and say, oh, you're chatting complete rubbish. But when the fantastic Dr. Keita mirrors exactly what I've said, you'll hear crickets. Okay, it goes incredibly silent. So I love this. This is just like kind of like catharsis for me.
Across a wide time period also too. So they don't really have a population in the classic sense of something fairly tightly constricted. They have, there's an assumption there. And then they use the Bayesian sky plot method to predict back into time. And they say, well, we've got this many data points. And so they're projecting back into time. I think that was dishonest. I don't know how that got by the referees, because I can take the facial, I can take the crania from that time period, from the latest date that they have there. And they're not like the Badarians, okay? They're not like the people who started the ship,
Okay.
so to speak,
Okay.
or the Nakata, early Nakata. And it gets tricky too to understand which is the most, who is the most accurate representative. But let's remember that Gamal Mukhtar, the Egyptian who wrote the introduction to the UNESCO History of Africa, Volume 2, he wrote the introduction. While he pointed out, he included Sheikh Anta Diop's essay there. He said that some people would not agree with the way that Sheikh Anta Diop said it, but he clearly asserts the Africanity of Egypt and that the population would have been have a range of colors. And this is an Egyptian. He's dead now. He lived to be very old, I think. I'm not mistaken, because I think one of my teachers from graduate school actually met him, was on a tour with him many years ago. And this particular professor of mine, Audrey Smedley, you can look her up. She wrote a book, Race in North America, History of a Concept, something like that, which is one of the official books of the American Anthropological Association. She's African American. When she was in Egypt, she said, she was on tour. She said, well, they say these people came from, Southwest Asia, and the tour guide, the Egyptian, I think it was Gamal Mukhtar, because she would have gone with a group of professors. She said, no, they were African, straight up, But being an African doesn't mean that you have a blue-black skin and have a certain singular set of physical characteristics. How could it be? Think about it. If modern humans emerged in Africa.
And to be clear, that fact remains true, okay? A lot of people, I think the point being argued against here is the true Negro trope, okay? Which I think many people fell for when they first got into ancient Kemet, and they think to themselves, the reason people fall for the true Negro trope, let me just take you through this very, very quick story. Why do people fall for the true Negro trope? And what's the true Negro trope? The idea that the true African, a true representation of a black person, is someone who has blue back skin, just like mentioned by Dr. Keita there, and very extremely broad nose, extremely big lips, and extremely tightly curled, almost peppercorn hair. That's what a true black is. And any deviation from that, anybody with slightly lighter skin, anybody with slightly softer hair, anybody with slightly narrower nose, anybody with slightly thinner lips, all of a sudden these are expressions of mixing. These are a result of outsiders coming in and diluting the Africanity of that individual. The problem is that people believe this because they likely had never been to the African continent. It only takes one visit to any African country. Not even like, I mean, literally any African country, from Congo to Nigeria, to Gabon, to Ethiopia, to Kenya, to Uganda, to Rwanda, to Mozambique, to Tanzania. So you could pick any one of those nations, and the diversity that you will see will blow your mind. And that diversity has not happened because there's been this huge backflow of Europeans, whites, coming to mix with the locals. That diversity belongs to Africa. Africans were diverse before Europeans existed. Let me repeat that statement because I don't want you to miss it. Africans were diverse before and out of Africa took place. Dr. Keita is going to expand upon this. Africans were diverse before an out of Africa event even took place. Okay, we already had variance in skin complexion. We already had variance in hair texture. We already had variance in feature set. That diversity belongs to Africa. So the true Negro trope really is a result. People believing in that is people who have bought into the Eurocentric historical narrative, which said nobody before the Europeans, blacks were here, browns were here, whites were here, and then Christopher Columbus came and got a big spoon and stirred up the world and mixed people about. That's what people believe, genuinely. Yeah, they think that all these static populations. All the blacks were blicky black and very isolated, and all the Asians were over there. The China people, the Han Chinese people were all over there and isolated, and all the Indians were over there and isolated, and all the whites were over here. And it took the ingenuity of the white explorer to bring out his big spoon and to stir the world and to bring people from region to region and to create all of this diversity. Except no. That's got no anthropological, no genetic, nothing supports that absolute nonsense. Nothing supports that. In fact, this world, I would stress, is less diverse. It's probably at its least diverse. Regions have been ethnically cleansed to support the point I'm making there. What you have is you've had the European go around the world, and as a result, regions have been ethnically cleansed. Black people who used to exist in every part of the continent have now become largely restricted to the African continent. I say largely, not completely. What has happened is ethnic cleansing and a narrowing of phenotype in each region. That's what the European has done, not the reverse. So you've gone from a very diverse, very mixed global world to a very phenotypically narrowed world as a result of European intervention. Once you have that in your mind, you'll realize how stupid the true Negro trope is. Okay, I know I went around the houses a little bit there. I will let it play for a bit now.
Africa, 200,000 years ago, they were just saying round numbers, and didn't leave until 60 or 70 or 65,000 years ago. Or you pick your number. They had over 100,000 years to accumulate new mutations in different environments in Africa. And now we have a theory that suggests that perhaps there was a polycentric origin of modern humans, that there was substructuring in Africa before people left. So you look at Jebel Irhoud, the remains from Morocco. They're not quite modern, but they're close. And you look at other stuff, Kabwe and whatever, these things are all on the path. So if what we call modern traits emerged in any group and they're sharing genes across this vast space of Africa, you're still going to have some substructuring, right? You're going to have some differences that persist across that time, although the origin is still African. The emergence of modern human is African. Modern human brains are an African invention, for those who want to express it that way when you get in a bad argument with the wrong people. They say, well, what has Africa given us? If certain people ask you that, you say, go look in the mirror. Just go look in the mirror. That's what Africa has given us. Humans, you, whether you like it or not. So I would, and I just said that to add a little levity to our conversation, but modern humans emerged in Africa. And living humans have DNA from some of the other so-called archaic Homo sapiens, if you want to call them that, or from another point of view, they're just another race of human beings, of Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens sapiens is predominantly what we are, Homo sapiens sapiens, but we have evidence of DNA from either what some people call other archaic species, or some people say simply other subspecies at particular time depths. So that's a different type of discussion.
One of the discussions I like to have, and I'm just going to quickly throw this one out there, and I will continually bring this one back, is a very nice litmus test you can do. Is the only modern humans that express 100% Homo sapien DNA, as I'm going to say, are Africans, and I mean unmixed Africans. I'd like to just use the word African, but then people will try and shoehorn in North Africans, and I'm making it clear that North Africans are a result of admixture with Black Sea slaves. So I'm not talking about North Africans. I'm talking about true Africans, native Africans, not coastal Africans. So native Africans are the only people you'll find who have 100% Homo sapien DNA. So why is that important? Because we're the only humans that you'll find who have no Neanderthal admixture and no Denisovan admixture, zero. So they have zero outside admixture of a kind of like hominid species that have been interbred with. So the only people that you'll find that are 100% human DNA are native Africans. That's a fact. They know this. Okay, so that's one of those irrefutable facts. Now, where they don't like this fact brought up is when you start talking about ancient populations and they start saying, oh, well, he has this marker, that marker, this, that, and the other. It's like, okay, cool. What's his percentage of Neanderthal DNA? Because all of your ancestors have Neanderthal DNA. Every single one. So if you look at a European, there's not a single non-African presenting European that doesn't have Neanderthal DNA, and at a high percentage, at the very, very, very least 1%. And one by the time it's at 1%, we're talking about people who are basically mixed race. Those would be like your people in the Mediterranean who probably have high amounts of African DNA that they're denying. But your average European, 2 to 4%. Okay, Neanderthal DNA, irrefutable fact. So they pull up these ancient groups. So, for instance, Natufians who have traced to 0 Neanderthal DNA, which to me makes the argument quite clearly. Well, then they were just Africans. Okay, that's all. They were Africans. They haven't admixed with the people that made you. So therefore, they just remained Africans. These are definitely people who in modern times would resemble you and I. But they don't want to do that. They don't want to have that kind of very basic logical discussion about who people are. That's when they'll go, oh well, no, actually, if we've seen this marker here and this is carried by this group. No. Let's be clear on this. Yeah, those people that you're pointing to all have Neanderthal DNA. Okay, someone said up to 20%, and yes, you are correct, but that's not the DNA that shows. Although you are correct, that's the admixture. If you want to listen to Dr. David Reich, who essentially says that the Neanderthal ancestry has been selected out. So the genome chose to select out the Neanderthal ancestry because it was deficient. But in reality, the modern European is likely 1/5 Neanderthal. The only reason he doesn't show 1/5 Neanderthal DNA is because Neanderthal DNA is in all ways, shapes and forms deficient to the Homo sapien DNA. And so the genome chose to select it out. So that's another point you can raise to people when Europeans try and make this argument that the Neanderthal was more intelligent and more artistic and more this and more that than the Homo sapien. Well, the argument you can raise to them is, well, the genome didn't agree. Yeah, the genome didn't agree. The genome said these genes are deficient and we need to replace them with more Homo sapien. Yeah, that's what the population geneticists say, yeah, who are on your side. Yeah, let's be real. That's what the population geneticists that are on your side are turning around and saying to you, nope, this is deficient DNA. It has been selected out. Okay, and as a result, we're only showing 2% when we should be showing 20%. That's how deficient that DNA is. So that argument there needs to be left on the shelf. But the point being, when they pull up these ancient population groups like the Natufians, for instance, who don't show any Neanderthal DNA, then that means they were African. There's not really a further discussion there. They haven't gone through. You can't claim those Europeans if they haven't gone through the same process that created Europeans. All Europeans went through the Neanderthal factory. Okay. All Asians went through the Neanderthal Denisovan factory. Okay. They all gone through that same factory. If these people didn't go through that factory, then that means they're just Africans. They haven't gone through that change. They remained Africans. Very easy discussion to have, guys. Incredibly easy discussion to have. You cannot claim these groups as being Europeans because their feet touch the Eurasian landmass. That's not how science works. Anyway, let's carry on.
So this polycentric notion of modern human origins versus a single population, say in Southern or Eastern Africa, that kind of emerges from what came before and then populates the world is a little bit. So those are the two competing ideas, and they can work together. You can still have the polycentric notion and still wind up with a single population that becomes the entity, so to speak, if you see what I mean. So that's possible. And let's just remember too that we should not be surprised that there might be some people in Africa who seem to be more related or more similar to people outside of Africa. I mean, not including any migrations from the Islamic period, from the Phoenicians, from anybody, not anybody coming back at all. We should be able to understand that modern people who left Africa would have left from a particular place. They didn't all get together from all corners of Africa. So there would have been some differences. There would have been some differences between modern humans in different places. So wherever they left from, we should not be surprised that there would be people on the outside of Africa, or some Africans rather, who might be more similar, possibly more similar, more related, or have more DNA in common with some people on the outside than they did with other Africans who were far more distant geographically than being from the same space that they left from.
So,
So before the host comes in there, he's speaking to there about African genomic diversity and the fact that Africa is so much more exponentially diverse than Europe that it's common that you'll find even within a single landmass. Like let's take Nigeria, which is more diverse than all of Europe combined. I would actually say all of Eurasia combined. I think that's defensible as well. But let's take a nation like Nigeria. You could take an individual from Nigeria and their genetic material or their genetic makeup would be closer to a European than it would be to another one of their neighbors. Now, the point being made here is not that the Nigerian is from Europe. The point being made here is that Africa, or Nigeria in this case, is so genetically diverse that the gaps between two individuals can look humongous. Okay, that's the point being made here. The gaps between they can be, the technical term for this is heterozygosity. Okay, and the Africans have a much higher heterozygosity, so they have this massive amount of difference. Okay, and it's shown in something called, basically we have short linkage disequilibrium, and to make this, I'm going to make this as plain as possible to kind of like explain, or to for you guys to understand, is that all Europeans are recently related. Okay, and so they have long chains of linkage disequilibrium, which is just basically repeating patterns. It's a kind of a polite way of saying you guys are recently, you've got a recent ancestor. It's a polite way of saying that. Yeah. So you've got that linkage disequilibrium. And what does that mean? This means mum meets dad. Yeah. Okay. And huge regions of their genome are the same. So mum's got this long chain of DNA, okay, and dad's got this long chain of DNA, and because their long chains of DNA are identical, when they're smushed together in that process of recombination, it stays the same, because it takes the top half of mum's and the bottom half of dad's, it smushed them together, and you get exactly the same chain. That's linkage disequilibrium. Okay, so you have these long chains of linkage disequilibrium that are shared across the entire European population. In Africa, we don't have that. So even though you've got this, you've got this population that is relatively not that large, if you get two individuals, it's very rare that they'll have these long chains of matching genetics. So when they get smushed together, it creates this new chain of genetics. Okay, that's that shorter or sometimes non-existent linkage disequilibrium that exists on the African continent. That's the diversity. Africa is incredibly diverse because they've always mixed. Africans have always mixed and have always bred outwards. Always, always. That's the history of the African continent. So you've got this huge amount of genetic diversity that exists, which means that I wouldn't say no to Africans, but two Africans can look very, very, very different, completely different. Whereas it's almost impossible for two Europeans, so to speak, to look completely different. They're always going to look very similar because you don't have to trace back that far to get that common ancestor. Okay, so that's how that kind of difference occurs, and that's how you could get a situation where you get an African and their DNA looks more similar to a European than it does to a neighboring African. But that's because Africa is just so diverse. The genetic distance between two people who could look very, very similar is actually massive, because we don't have those long chains of genetics. I hope I've explained that well, but that's basically the phenomena there of Africans' kind of genetic diversity versus Europeans.
That's one of those points. That's one of those points. Go ahead.
And once you think about that, you have to think about that now. I'm going to use another type of.
All right, go ahead. That's the serious point.
Let me just use another kind of example. If Black folks from Ohaski, North Carolina, where people have a lot of European ancestry, but they're Black, they call themselves Black at least on most days. If they left and went to a desert, to an island someplace, and they would call themselves African American, that would not be a representative sample of all of the people that call themselves African American. You understand what I'm saying?
I got that.
Okay, so let us remember that the modern humans who left were certainly core modern humans, and certainly had all of that core stuff that makes you modern human in them. But at the level of certain types of DNA, they may have been different. Now, I mean, or rather, they wouldn't have been the same as people in other places. So, and that shouldn't be particularly surprising. We know that if you look at strictly the Y chromosome, which I like to use as a model, we have A and B haplotypes, which arose in Africa, and E group and D for that matter, maybe all of the major Y chromosome haplotypes, but A and B were geographically or seem to have been more geographically separated, so you don't really find them outside of Africa. But the D haplogroup, or the things derived from the M68, the D and the E groups, haplogroups, you have those in Africa and you have them on the outside of Africa as well. The E probably left later. The point.
Now, it's important to note here, the point in the discussion he's going to now talks about kind of like the origin of these Y haplogroup lineages, and he's actually got a very good paper on this called, I think it's called Interpreting African Genomic Diversity. Don't quote me on that. It could be genetic diversity, but something like that. But it's Interpreting African Genomic Diversity. It's a paper that he did with, I think it's Rick Kittles, and he explains the fact that all of that diversity that's found outside of the African continent in terms of kind of like haplotypes likely occurred in the African continent and perhaps was carried out in waves, okay, from the African continent. Whereas the argument is, or at least the argument that modern population geneticists try to make, is that there was this single event, yeah, that occurred 70,000 years ago. This one group of Africans went out and then they've just been evolving ever since, and never the twain shall meet. The problem with this model is it has no support, okay? It has no support. It has no base in reality. Reality suggests that Africans have continually traversed into the European continent. But the reason they don't want to acknowledge that is they don't want to acknowledge the possibility that actually it's been Africans bringing that diversity into Europe in these waves of introgression, which would make sense because diversity exists on the African continent, okay? Whereas in Europe, diversity is going to be narrow, especially if they're coming from one single set. They're not going to continually be evolving. Their genome doesn't show that kind of evolution. So it's very likely that these different clades were carried from the African continent into Europe in waves, okay? And that's what we see. We see these kind of like waves of movement. We even see these kind of like fixed dual continental populations like the Ibero-Mauritans, like the Natufians, etc., etc. All these people who clearly traversed between the African and the Eurasian continent, okay? That's much more likely. So when the reason I'm raising this point is when these markers show up on the African continent, the way they can acknowledge them without acknowledging them is by saying, oh, that's a result of an introgression. So what actually happened is Europeans then came back and they put it there. It's not really, this doesn't belong in Africa. So that way they can limit Africa and say, oh yeah, Africans are all E. When they see a kind of like a more random marker turn up in Africa, they could say, oh, well, there's clearly just a background migration, or there was some kind of a movement here. Perhaps there was a European who came to collect slaves and left some kids with a local or whatever. They always have a kind of an excuse. But the issue that they have is that according to their model, Africa shouldn't show any of this kind of diversity because once again, it was a dark continent, okay, where nothing was happening. So why isn't all of this diversity showing, and this is one of the arguments I make, why isn't all of this diversity showing in Sumeria? Or why isn't all of this diversity showing in Iraq? These hub centers, why isn't all this diversity shown in Greece? Because these were hub centers. These were, the Mediterranean was, oh yeah, that's the center, that's the fertile crescent, they like to call it. Yeah, so we should see every single haplotype, every single subclase should be present in all of these populations, but they're not. They're just present in Africa. So you have to ask the question, why is that diversity all found in Africa and not found in all of these alleged hotbeds of trade and merchantry? It's an incompatibility of logic that you'll only see applied when it comes to Africa. When in Africa, everything is explained away. The great thing is Dr. Keita doesn't explain it away. He says quite openly, I think many of these markers have their origin point in Africa. And I'll let him continue.
Point being that there's a commonality for some things, that there's some people outside of Africa or some people in Africa who are on a lineage that's more related to some people on the outside than it is to people on the inside.
So let me jump in real quick.
Anyway, but that should not, and that's way beyond the Schoeneman. I've answered the Schoeneman question.
Yeah, you did that.
And so, but I was just trying to make a larger point that that you can model statistically, it makes sense, and what have you. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's one of those points that's counterintuitive when you hear it. That and the way you explained it brings real clarity to it. Because if you make the statement that there's populations in Africa that are more closely related to a population outside of Africa than population within Africa, you're like, oh my goodness, what are you trying to say? That was one of those points that I couldn't quite wrap my brain around it. But I thought you did a great job of explaining that on how vast Africa is and how there are been around. You talk about how the population been around for 350, maybe 200,000 years, depending on who you're talking to, and there's time for mutations to occur and all that, and the possibilities of a diverse population makes sense. And so if the population is diverse, and one just group leaves out of Africa, then of course they could be more related than would be inside. That's very interesting right there.
Yeah, well, yeah. There's actually an article by a man named You, a group, You and his colleagues, You, and it's got a title something like greater diversity between Africans than between some Africans and non-Africans. Last name You, so you can find that. So this idea.
So that's what I was just talking about, that diversity that exists between Africans. It's huge. Okay, it's exponentially larger than that which is seen in groups outside of Africa. And once again, it's linked to that shorter linkage disequilibrium, and the fact that essentially are you could argue that the breeding habits of Africans are more rooted in antiquity. I was going to say they're healthier, but some people would take offense to that. So I'm just going to say they're more rooted in antiquity. And as a result, that's created a kind of like a massive kind of like girth of differentiation between the different populations. And not even just, within the different populations of Africa, not even between them.
Yeah, I mean, I came to this conclusion on my own before I saw that paper. And it's not something there's nothing special about it. It's just that it's not talked about in particular ways, because you have people talking about Africa as a monolith. You have it gets talked about in a certain way. So, if it emerged in Africa, it's African. That's how I look at it. And
I appreciate the fact that he's mentioned there about people talking about Africa like it's a monolith, because it's the most ridiculous thing to do. Okay, the idea that you're going to these tests and they'll have a single sample representing Africa is the most stupid thing, given what I've just explained to you guys about how kind of like linkage disequilibrium works and the high heterozygosity. The idea of taking that incredibly diverse population and having 50 samples to represent Eurasians who are all very closely related, and then having one sample to represent Africans who are largely very, very unrelated because of their massive amount of and we're talking about genetically here. What you should have is the reverse. You should have really like probably 20 to 30 African samples for every European/Eurasian sample, but it doesn't work that way, or at least they don't want it to work that way, because they know they can hide a multitude of sins/relations/ commonality by picking a certain sample, because they know Africans are so diverse that if that sample misses, it's going to miss by a long shot and they're going to appear closer. These are the tricks they play with. This is why I like to go back to the Neanderthal argument. How much Neanderthal have they got? Okay, cool, they're African. End of discussion. Let's move on.
Got you. Okay.
And if it gets put together in Africa by Africans, it's also African. So if it's that there used to be the Hamitic concept. Well, we'll talk about that later.
Okay. All right, let's get to the next slide, Mr.
Kiss by Arton. By the way, I just want to say very quickly, I love hearing statements like that. So feel free to drop any links, or even if you don't want to drop a link, drop a title, drop the name of a paper that people can then research and reference. Feel free to do that here. This is the chat. This is the place to do it. And we're having a discussion right now. So I appreciate you mentioning the fact that, yes, the tides are changing. There's more focus being put on those. I've done a paper myself. I'm not a geneticist, obviously. But I think the things that I raised in the paper, which are about kind of the ascertainment bias and the use of Eurocentrically biased genotyping arrays. I did a paper on that, which I think was incredibly useful, incredibly insightful, and incredibly needed for us to understand how they're skewing the data using very agendered testing systems. And I think once we become privy to that, thank you very much, Kiss Barton. Once we become privy to that, it opens our eyes to the tricks that are being used, and so you can't fall for it again. Once you're looking for, okay, well, what genotyping array did you use when you conducted this study? Oh, okay, so you're using the Eurocentric genotyping array because you want to get a certain kind of result. For those of you who, some of what I'm saying is going over your head, I've actually got a really good documentary that you could check out. It's relatively short and it kind of covers this subject in a good amount of detail. So feel free to check that out. But yeah, shout out to you. Second, I'm going to change my camera because it looks like my one that I'm using is about to overheat. So I'm just going to switch over. Boom, boom. Let's go for this one. Sorry, I know this one isn't looking quite as luscious as the other one, but you know, it is what it is. All right, let's carry on.
It's true, man. Let's get to the next slide. Yeah. I'm glad you made that clear. At times we struggle. I know I did. Okay, the next question. Oh, you got. Let me see. Go back. Go back one, Mr.
That's the Schunemann.
Oh, that's true. Okay, go ahead. All right. So in the next section now, my fault. I apologize. Culture and history, section 2. Next slide. Did the ancient Egypt, and you kind of touched on this a little bit. Did ancient Egypt develop from local source primarily, or from external sources, and brought to?
The answer is no. I mean, the answer is yes. It developed from local sources primarily and integrated things on its own terms into what was there previously. It's just like you know, if you're a farmer and you're doing your land, you've been farming for a long time, and then you decide instead of just to grow peanuts, you grow something else. Well, it's still your farm under your control. Or if you decide to take your peanuts and cross them with some peanuts from someplace else that make them different, it's still your peanuts. You know, they're still local. Now, could you change something to a point where something becomes unrecognizable? Yeah, conceivably, but you know, that's not what we're talking about. And also even in terms of the history of ideas, you have people like Denon, who went with, I think, Napoleon to Egypt and all this. Denon, I don't think, was a scientist himself, but he said something very interesting that reveals an evolutionary perspective at a time when evolution hadn't been thoroughly. And the language isn't perfect; it's quaint and maybe even crude. But he said something to the effect that the ancient Egyptian, you're looking at dynastic portraits. Ancient Egyptian is the authentic African, with the Negro being an extreme variant. So he's reversed the polarity, so to speak, in terms of his definitions, his defining. And that's just an interesting idea to think about.
Very interesting. Okay. Steph, go ahead. Next slide, please.
By the way, guys, I'm still here.
What can skeletal analysis tell us about the possible connection between?
Sorry. By the way, guys, sorry, I'm still here. Unfortunately, this camera does like to trip out a little bit. It's a bit annoying. So I'll wait for my other one to cool down. Let me see if I can get this one back on again. There we go. It does trip out a lot, this camera. It's really, really annoying. I don't know why it does that. It just does like it just has a little software glitch. But anyway, let's carry on.
Ancient Egyptians and their neighbors.
Well, if you look at the long bones, you can make an assessment as to whether or not they're cold adapted or warm adapted. Although some people would argue that the skeletal proportions and so forth may also tell you something about adaptations to living conditions. You know, that's something you have to make up your own mind. But the Egyptians have a tropical body plan. And there have been several papers about this. Sometimes it gets expressed in racial language. So there was a paper a long time ago that said that their limb ratios were super negroid. Okay, talking about the early pre.
So he's talking about the, I think that's the Robbins 1986 paper he's talking about. Robbins 1985 calls them Negro limb or black limb proportions. And I think Zakrzewski did a paper as well. If that was it, Sonia Zakrzewski, I think, did a paper as well. And all of the papers that have been, studies that have been done on ancient Egyptians have found them to cluster, you know, really heavily in the side of having quote unquote Negroid limb proportions. That's the word that's been used, and people get offended when I say black on it, but I was like, this is the words that are literally on the paper, and that's even modern studies. So even Nurat Man had his limbs measures. He came up dead center of the Negroid limb proportions. Okay, so even these modern studies, which they're attempting to use to say he wasn't black, even though he had Negroid limb proportions, and even though he had a very African skull with a snub nose and post-pragmatic limb depression in his skull, subnasal prognathism, a broad nasal passage, dolichocephalic skull, like literally all of the trademark, this is a black man kind of like physical expressions. They still try to use that little argument of 20% Levantine DNA to kind of like fool people, you know, into thinking that he wasn't, you know, he wasn't. Even his to be clear, even his complexion, based on the Harris-Plex study that they did, had him sitting between a 5 and a 6. So I think he was something like, if I remember correctly, 60% 5, 30% 6. Okay, so he was sitting between a 5 and a 6, which would make him darker than brother Keita on the screen. Okay, darker skin than that. He would be that would be somewhere between my complexion and brother Keita's complexion. So this is, by all intents and purposes, a very comfortable, normal looking African person who was found in Africa with African limb proportions. This is why Dr. Keita likes to argue with biological affinities and not the fuzzy logic of genetics. He'll frequently go back to these things because these are things that are kind of like, they're true yesterday and they're true today. Okay, they're true yesterday and they're true today. It's very unlikely you're going to find a European. I know most of you are going Holland right now, but even him, he doesn't have the Negro limb proportions, although he does have, you know, thick lips and a broad nose. He doesn't have the other traits, even though he's probably the closest thing to someone who looks like a living albino. He even fails to have the expression of Africanity of the ancient Egyptians. They were literally the most, you know, extreme looking kind of like native black population that you could find. That's what their skull, that's what their skull and their limbs suggest to us. So irrespective of them trying to trick you with these, you know, compressed African hair and could trick you like, oh, they were blondies, it's like, no, because you just don't have modern Europeans walking around with these proportions. They have, they call them cold adapted proportions. I call them Neanderthaloid proportions or Neanderthalic proportions, because that's where they inherited the longer torso and the shorter limbs from. That is a kind of like Neanderthal proportions, and that comes from the contribution of ancestry. And Asians have it at an even more extreme end. But these kind of physical affinities are real. This isn't me throwing out kind of phrenology and trying to bring back racial sciences. Not at all. We can comfortably say this person looks like his ancestors evolved in this region of the earth, which is what the limb proportion argument does, just to be clear for everybody. Let me just see if I can get my camera back on.
Yeah, that's the Egyptians. And then even some later New Kingdom Egyptians in the South. Let's just call this a tropical body pattern. So we know they didn't come from Norway. Okay, so that's important. And Holocene, I mean, or from the Siberian steppes, which of course nobody says. Craniofacial analysis, the question there becomes on what do you understand your range of variation to be? Well, if you don't have evidence of migration in, then you do have to set a notion about what's indigenous. And so when you do multivariate analyses, the stuff that I do, you find out that the early Egyptians have overlapped greatly with people from like the Sudan, Somalis, and later Egyptians verge in a direction more along, people say in Northwest Africa, but also, if you want to call that, in a European direction. In one study, in one large volume called Cranial Variation in Man, 1973, W.W. Howes uses 70 variables, a lot of measurements, and on a late dynastic Northern Egyptian series from the very latest time. So, you know, you're not going to be surprised to know that in some analyses, it groups with Europeans, right? But also in another analysis, and this,
to be clear, he specified very clearly that he's talking about later quote unquote Egyptians. So we're talking post Ptolemaic period. Normally, when we're talking about later Egyptians, okay, so we're not talking about dynastic era. So this could be anything from the Persian era right up until the Roman era when we're talking about later Egyptians. So it's important that we kind of like classify which ones, and also, you know, which studies as well, because there have been studies that have been done with a massive amount of, I want to use the word agenda. So the study done by C. Loring Brace, which kind of manipulated the measurements around the nasal index to suggest relationship and ignored all of the other physical traits. So it kind of proposed or presented itself like a multivariate analysis, but in the end it just focused literally on the projection and the width of the nose to suggest ethnicity, which is absolutely stupid, because like I say all the time, Europeans likely inherited their narrow noses from Africans. So you can't then use, nose width alone, because we know we have narrow nosed populations, loads of them, loads of narrow nosed people in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, loads of narrow nasal index populations there, without any need for contribution from outside to get those. That's a lot of people will say that's a high altitude adaptation there. So you just have to be careful about who's presenting what study, which I think he's got to come on to say anyway.
This is all in the same book, so you can see it. It clusters with tropical people. Now, some interesting characters, not only tropical Africans, but groups like the Andamese, which really shouldn't have been included in the study. But anyway, since they're not players in that scene. The point, though, and then when you do look at a plot, using another technique, they plot right in the middle. And these are late dynastic northern Egyptians, measured very meticulously, many different ways. So what you measure may also give you different results too. So you have to understand that. It's very important to understand that. It's very important to understand that variables can make a difference. So you try to choose your variables that are the most heritable and that cover most of the craniofacial region. And so that's a comment on similarity. Not all similarity necessarily means a close genetic or genealogical relationship.
Correct.
But as long as you have some context for what you're looking at, historical context, no matter whether derived from archaeology or otherwise, you have it's reasonable. You can make reasonable assumptions, and you most certainly can comment on patterns. Now, if you run in an Egyptian skull in a test space or any skull, and it groups with somebody from northern Siberia, then either that person is a foreigner or they're just a very unusual person with unusual personal characteristics, and things like that do happen. Things like that do happen.
Okay. All right. Where you at? Let's get the next slide up. Appreciate that answer.
And I thought I'd just chime in very briefly on that point that he's raised there as well. And that's, the important is that when we're doing these kinds of analysis and these kind of studies, when we're trying to understand who the ancient Egyptian people are, we can't take isolated incidents and then, extrapolate them out to a population. This is something that the Schunemann study did, okay, where they've essentially started with, I think, a sample set of 151, which they might as well have not mentioned because they only got DNA from 90, I think, of them. And of those 90, those are all kind of like mitochondrial DNA only, apart from 3 of which they got mitochondrial and Y DNA. So we're just talking about uniparental lineages here. No nuclear DNA, no autosomal DNA. And I think only 1 did they manage to get nuclear DNA from. So they made all these conclusions from the fact that they had a few kind of like maternal and paternal markers, okay, from a foreign tomb, all of these other problems that we've already talked about. We don't need to go over and over again. But then they're extrapolating and they're making a conclusion for the whole region. And this is one of the points that Dr. Keita is saying here. He's saying, look, anomalies can happen as well. This is one of the important things, so that Nurat man, for instance, as much as I could sit here and argue that he's typically African in his presentation, in his expression, in his physical proportions, in kind of like in his in the analysis of his DNA, looking at the high-risk plex model, etc., etc. I could argue that he's just physically typically African in the fact that he has very trace Neanderthal ancestry as well. By the way, very trace. I think he has like the equivalent of less than 10% of the Neanderthal ancestry that a European would have. So that's kind of like in line with lots of Africans. Many of us have very tiny trace. So anything that's traced to zero, you can assume that person's black, Not, 10 ancestors. That's the equivalent of having 10 ancestors, one white, nine black. It's irrelevant. You're not going to even see the European ancestry if that was the case. Now, the point being, Nurat Man could have been an anomaly. We don't know that. His tomb wasn't, particularly. I'm not convinced that that was a native tomb. That kind of like pot that they found him in. I'm not convinced of that being kind of like a natively used tomb, but he could have been an anomaly. In spite of all the fact that I think he's a black man, the fact of the matter is he could have been a foreigner. That's why you can't raise those kind of conclusions, and this is what all of these studies do. As soon as they find any data that supports their Eurasian fantasy, it's like, we've discovered like, you haven't discovered anything. Like, you've just found an individual. Just call the study what it is and stop trying to extrapolate about what ancient Egypt was, because ancient Egypt proves, or ancient Kemet I should say, proves itself with its culture, proves itself with all the other strings of anthropology to be natively African every single time without any shadow of a doubt. It doesn't need people making wild assumptions based on individuals. So I think it's important, and I'm glad that Dr. Keita raised that.
So, wait till she get that together. Okay, here we go. Afrocentric perspectives. Man, section 3. This is gonna be a good section. Go ahead.
By the way, guys, it's about to get wild. Okay, I can't remember exactly what I encountered here, but knowing what this guy is like, as soon as you see the word Afrocentric, you're going to see and hear things that are derogatory and untrue. And even though I do not classify myself as an Afrocentric, I just classify myself as a historian or someone who's a independent researcher who happens to have a perspective that leans towards what I consider to be the truth. I know that label is allegedly applied to me, and I'm happy to wear it with pride. Just like I'm happy if people want to call me woke. Yeah, whatever floats your boat. Call me woke. I don't give a crap. I'll be whatever it is anti you. So whatever means that I'm not like you, I'm happy to take that label on. So if you want to call me Afrocentric, woke, yeah, call me all those names. But when it's coming out of these guys' mouth, this is how they create differentiation between themselves and what they call blackologists, okay? Because black people, in their view, are inferior. We're inferior-minded people. We're inferior when it comes to research. We're inferior when it comes to conclusions. We're not able to argue our position, apparently. Okay, and they're smarter because they believe in the science of the science of the white man. So this is what we're about to get here, guys.
Okay, next. How do you define an African-centered approach to history, and how is it different from mainstream Afrocentrism?
Okay,
so you can see where this question is basically been drafted from a position of bad faith. How is it different from what's mainstream Afrocentrism? He hasn't defined what that is. He's just said, how's African-centered approach different from mainstream Afrocentrism? I didn't know there was mainstream Afrocentrism. This is interesting, but let's see the response.
I am not authority on this humanities theorizing theoretical positions. I know the person who wrote the book, The Afrocentric Idea and Afrocentricity. I know Molefe Asante. I know that he wasn't the first person to use the phrase Afrocentric too. I also know that Afrocentric thought or claims have sometimes been related to ideas that basically say that everything worthwhile has come from Africa in a very specific kind of way, oftentimes without the kinds of evidence that would be required to write about this or teach about it and what have you. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, however, so you have to be careful you don't make absolute statements. Now, African-centered, so I would say Afrocentricity, in the way that Molefe Asante wanted it to be, is something that focused on African culture. I mean, it's sort of from a disciplinary point of view, focused on African culture, values, myths, things of the African world as its subject matter. That's how some people might see it. But clearly the term Afrocentric gets applied to other things. For example, I'll never forget somebody created a Bart Simpson, a black Bart Simpson, a brown Bart Simpson. Oh, we got Afrocentric Bart Simpson now, just because he was brown. Okay, now
I'm so glad that you picked up on that point there, because he's highlighting the fact that the word Afrocentrism here is being used just like the word woke as a derogatory way to talk about anything that applies blackness. Have you noticed how these dog whistles will always be created by dissenters when it comes to black people taking ownership, and they'll use it as a way to euphemize and to group any efforts. It's a way to pull down the highest efforts and to make them meaningless. Okay, so now I'm going to group whatever you're doing with whatever anyone who's doing who has that same perspective and say you all come from the same school of understanding. So that's what they're doing here. They're saying Afrocentrism is this big school of understanding, okay, and it's all false. That's what's being presented here. Afrocentrism is this big false school of understanding, and anything that basically empowers or suggests that black people are X, Y, and Z in history is a victim of the Afrocentric narrative, which is ultimately a false narrative. So that's the way this is being framed here. And I'm glad that he's pulled that out and said, you know, like, you've had people saying that Afrocentrism has been used to describe a black Bar Simpson. That's got nothing to do with Afrocentrism, okay, particularly in the way that it was defined by the person who coined it, who was Malefikete Asante. Okay, he didn't define it in that way. So I'm glad he mentioned that.
African-centered might be said to be just an approach to privileges, but Afrocentricity does this too. That privileges or desires to look at things from an African perspective or an Afro-American perspective, as opposed to being written from another cultural perspective. So that would be a part of Afrocentricity too. So
the importance of seeing things from an African or African American, or basically a black cultural perspective. Okay, that's essentially what this is. It's important for us to have our fields of knowledge that have been drafted by ourselves. I'm going to go on a very, very quick little tirade about academia, because I've been arguing a lot about academics recently, and the fact that where European academia sits now, in terms of the way they approach their studies, is a result of years where they've been able to get to this place where essentially a modern academic now, the way modern peer reviews, you know, wherever it is, kind of academic studies, you know, meta-analysis or any kind of like review of kind of like past papers, etc., etc. Regardless of what's being drafted, what you'll find is that they have these kind of like fixed approaches to way research is approached, and they have to go through these steps, and most of it is seated in secondary research. So you'll find most modern researchers, a large amount of their work sits in and around, you know, literature review and then ongoing referencing of work that's already been drafted. There's a point that I'm getting to here. Why is that important? Because essentially, the people who they're quoting, these historic people, these historic PhDs, these historic academics, so to speak, some of them weren't even qualified. You know, if we're talking about a Flinders Petrie, for instance, yeah, some of them didn't even have qualifications. On top of that, many of the ones who were qualified would simply just their papers. If you read these kind of like old papers, there's just them quoting their theory for a few pages or a few hundred pages, whatever. It's just their theories. There's no kind of like, they're not falling back on any reference. They don't have anyone to answer to. It's just them giving their theories based on primary research they've conducted. I think this is this. I think this is that. Okay, there's not much to it. The point being raised is that they're in a luxurious position now because all they need to do is reference the people who have done the work before them. African-centered scholars are very much having to start from scratch. So we're at a position where a lot of our scholars are having to do or revisit the primary research. We don't have the luxury of quoting our 20th century and 19th century scholars because they were excluded. We don't have many who were in the field at that time. So we have to revisit the work that was done. Sometimes we have to discard it wholly. We have to discard individuals. So there's a different route of evolution we're taking because we're trying to reconstruct or trying to construct a history that actually makes sense from the history that they've been bastardizing for the past 200 years. So sometimes people kind of like do not realize how much harder it is for Afrocentric or African centered scholars. And this is why scholarship by a lot of our scholars, I wouldn't say is sometimes sparse of referencing, but sometimes heavily weighted towards primary research, because it's not that easy to find the quotes supporting what you understand, because no one's done that original type of research. I'll give an example. Myself, currently in the process of writing my book, and 80% of the references in my book are to primary research. Okay, I'm talking about the fact that, for instance, something that no one's ever spoke about before, from what I can see, that Howard Carter did a lot of sabotage. Okay, and he was open about it. They did a lot of paint stripping. Okay, you can see it in Howard Carter's notes. He talks about the use of the chemicals that were used to clean the brown stains off King Tutankhamun Shwabtis. This is open sabotage. Okay, it's never been spoken about before. We just take many of these artifacts that they've always looked like this. I don't have a secondary research person that I can refer to. I have to go through his notes by myself, and I have to find the notes and say, look, this is what he said. This proves that he's done this. It's a different kind of standard and a different approach to research, because we're having to essentially build from the ground up. There's no research paper that you could find. For instance, I've got that documentary about the Tomb of Seti, the Table of Nations, and the Book of Gates, okay, and the tampering and the use of, paper squeezes, yeah, to that have damaged the walls, and the fact that many of these walls don't look how they look like. There's no authoritative piece that's been done about the sabotage of the Tomb of Seti. It doesn't exist. You have to do that kind of research as primary research. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate or understand that there's a whole body of kind of like initial foundational work that needs to be done before we can get to the stage where getting a PhD or getting this or getting that is just a case of referencing a whole bunch of secondary research that's already been done. So that's the kind of slightly different position that we find ourselves in. I think it's important that people understand that there's a difference in terms of our starting points here.
So what can I give you as an example? Many of the listeners, audience here, will be familiar with the Afro-American historian John Hope Franklin, or other writers, Nell Painter. We got all kinds of Black American writers now. Isabel Wilson.
I've been very fortunate to interview Nell Painter. Very excellent, brilliant, and generous woman. She was so generous with her time. So don't know if she's watching this. This might probably very highly unlikely, but if she ever stumbles across this video, I just want to obviously give her a massive vote of thanks for taking the time to do that interview with me. A lovely, lovely woman. I've got immense respect for her.
I mean, I'm just saying, Arnold Taylor from 3 generations ago, Du Bois, who wrote Black Reconstruction. Okay, all right. Now, this is a little tricky because, and then, all right, so John Hope Franklin, I want to juxtapose John Hope Franklin against Vincent Harding. Vincent Harding wrote a book called There Is a River.
Mm-hmm.
There Is a River. John Hope Franklin wrote From Slavery to Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
From Slavery to Freedom was written in a classic academic style, dispassionate, and so we're going to talk about style here. Not that he didn't have his own commitments. I mean, John Hope Franklin's folks were from Oklahoma, so I think his grandfather got burned out in the massacre in 1921, as I recall. And he was a lawyer in Tulsa, I think, at that time or something. Now, Vincent Harding's book, There's a River, though, is written from the point of view, for lack of a better word, of the enslaved person, of the oppressed person. So imagine that you and I, okay, so let's imagine that you're telling a story sort of from the outside, from an outsider's view, even if you're from the inside, but you choose to tell it, in a particular way that makes it sound like you're doing it dispassionately or whatever. You choose it. But then you've got somebody else, your twin brother, who chooses to tell the story as he experiences it, as he sees it. Now, you're telling the same story. And we're not talking about telling lies here. We're just talking about perspective. We are talking about perspective. In Vincent Harding's book, There is a River, which I try to read once a year, and I recommend it. There are plenty of used copies out there. He's dead now, so it hasn't been redone or updated, or not updated, that's the wrong word. It hasn't been revised or anything, as far as I know. The river that he's talking about is the river of Afro-American life, and it's very specific to Afro-American life. And I think he makes references to things that you may not read in other history books about Afro-Americans. For example, some of the people didn't make it here, not because they jumped off the boat and drowned or died on the boat, but because they blew the boats up. They refused to be enslaved. I didn't know that until I read Vincent Harding's book. Okay, that's a very powerful statement about liberation. Okay, they threw fire into the magazines on the slave ships. Okay, I don't know how often it happened, but even if it happened only once, that's significant. Okay,
Just enough. Okay.
I like the fact that you mentioned that the passive slave narrative is something that I've never bought into. It's one of the reasons why I've always been quite skeptical about the proposed numbers of the alleged transatlantic trade, but also the manner in which it was carried out. I think there's a lot of mythos that goes along with there. And I was mentioning to my academy the other day that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, one of the most extraordinary claims is the number of people that were trafficked from Africa to the New World, to North and South America. That's an extraordinary claim, the number of people they say were trafficked. So you need extraordinary evidence. Unfortunately, that extraordinary evidence is very, very sparse. And so we have to ask the question about what the reality is around the numbers and the means and the actual, what actually took place there. And I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to let it carry on.
Say about that too. I'm gonna make a pitch, and Unc, you should tell the book company that we made a pitch on this book and that they owe you something. Okay, Common Winds. Okay. This book was written by Julia Scott, who died, the late Julia Scott, who is one of the best friends of a friend of mine from undergrad school. This book, Common Wind, subtitled Afro-American Currents, the Age of the Haitian Revolution. Let me put it up here. Julia Scott, young man, relatively young.
Common Wind. I see the Common Wind.
Common Winds. Common Wind.
Gotcha.
In a nutshell, what this book is about is how people networked. And even during the enslavement period between the Caribbean, South America, and North America, how messages were gotten to other people through sailors and through people who were not, they were sometimes free Black people. And just imagine a situation where you have a certain number of people who either buy their freedom or free, and they're carrying newspapers or they're spreading rumors that they hear or information. Because the English planters in Jamaica, the whites who lived in the Caribbean, let's not forget that there were white-owned plantations there in South America. They could not understand, well, how were the enslaved hearing this information that the king in Spain said this or that? And sometimes they acted on that information. They planned revolts because they thought the local whites were keeping information from them, right? So the Common Wind is about something that we need to get into right now, sharing information just like you're doing, but maybe not so much on YouTube. Maybe in church. Maybe chit-chatting at the local place where people maybe sit down and have their drinks or whatever they do, or on the basketball court, spreading information in the same way that dances when I was growing up would spread from New York to Florida.
Okay.
We'll go from city to city. Oh, this is how we do the boogaloo. This is how we do this. This is how we do that. Okay. So I would say that reading the Common Wind, which is something you need to be awake when you read it because it's got a lot of dense information. He learned 3 or 4 languages, went into the archives in Spain, Portugal, France, the Caribbean. He put a lot. This was his doctoral dissertation. Took it 30 years to get published, even though it became an underground classic. Many people referred to it when it was in its dissertation form. But he refused to change certain things that certain publishers at that time wanted him to do.
Okay.
And so he stuck to his guns. And he got tenure professor. He was a professor. I think he died from kidney failure. So take your blood pressure medicine, guys, and don't eat salt. Don't do a lot of salt. Get your exercise, drink your water, and read up on good diet.
That's what we doing.
And it doesn't mean that will, if you're going to get it, you might are going to still get it, but this will help you. Let me just say it that way.
Slow it down a little bit. So okay, I want to go back to that. So what I'm getting from it, Afro-centered, Afrocentric.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, yeah. So what? No. I'm saying. So what do you consider yourself? What would you say yourself to be? Because I know it's subjective though. I understand that. So what do you consider yourself to be? If you had to choose.
And to be clear, most people who they call Afrocentric, they've given that label to. They haven't consulted those people or asked them, what do you consider yourself? They just applied that label in a derogatory way. So I find it interesting, once again, that the question is being asked, well, what do you consider yourself? It's nice to be offered that as an option, isn't it? Excuse me for a moment, I need to answer this call.
Choose.
I would say that I have an African-centered perspective on African history, which means I want to tell it from the inside. In anthropological terms, that would be called an emic view versus an etic view. Emic comes from the word, is the suffix on phoneme. So phonemic is how the thing sounds itself. A phonetic is how we describe it. So phonetic is from the outside. Etic is an outside description. Emic. So etic is when I come to where I grew up, your neighborhood in Baltimore, and I look at it and using my social science training and theories and whatever, or medical training, whatever I use, and I use it to describe what's going on. Emic is when you tell the story.
Gotcha.
So emic is what Vincent Harding tried to do in There's the River. John Hope Franklin's book, even though he's African American and has his commitments, don't get me wrong, John Hope was a great man, but it's written in such a way that many academics could have written it the way that he wrote it.
Gotcha.
You see what I'm saying?
I got you.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that, and almost it seems like,
and just because it's written from the inside, I have to say this doesn't mean that it has to be factually wrong or that it's biased. Now, some cases it will be if it's your point of view, and sometimes that's why lawyers will let people tell their stories in the narrative, because asking the standing questions just won't get at the feeling and the depth of the circumstance. Okay, it just won't get there. Okay, so you can describe something objectively. Okay, I can describe this cranium here objectively in certain ways, it cannot describe itself. Okay, it cannot describe itself. So this is not a situation where that emetic distinction works. That works at the level of societies and people. You can try to tell though an emic story. You look at Chris Harriot's most recent book. He's not able to lecture on his book anymore, but this is sort of a broad general early history. Yeah, broad general. It's a broad general. It's kind of a history of.
All right, we're gonna stop right there, man. Take a little break, man.
Okay, I'm just gonna skip over because this is just gonna be the host advertising on their channel, and no offense, you're not here for that. So we'll get back to the content. Oh, there we are. Sorry about that as well. A little break that I had to kind of like put you through, guys. Apologies.
Y'all gotta hit the damn like button, man, to keep us in the algorithm, man. Y'all want to keep getting expert material, man. Y'all gotta support, bro. I don't do no plan. I don't do no capping, man. Let's get back to Dr. Keita.
Of technology, societies, early African stuff. It's not a quote unquote regular history book. I like what Chris did here. I don't know how many other people would have done it because it gives you some touchstones to think about things. It talks about a range of things, and he doesn't make any distinction between prehistory and history. In fact, I don't use that word. We talk about early history and later history. It's all history. It's all history.
All right. You know. All right. So we got that. So the point I want to make is it seems that people will use the Afrocentric model, and you know the doctor, you know him, but it seems to be it's actually associated with a lot of misinformation these days. And so what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think that I don't know all of the claims that you're talking about, but I do know that some people would say from a Black perspective that certain things have been hidden from us. And so the data and the information that they use, which is very suggestive, they take as automatic fact without fully exploring it. Okay. So, and some things I think that we have an interest in, or we have, we think that things have been hidden from us in such a way that we have to describe them and claim them once we find out that we might have a connection at any level. So that's how I would how I would tend to think about that.
Okay.
So for example, was Hannibal Black? I don't know.
I wouldn't know what it is.
But I don't know what that means. I mean, right. the Romans who fought against him did not call him an Ethiopian.
Right.
And they did describe other people in that part of Africa. The first part of Africa to be called Africa, actually, is up there, north of the northern part of the Saharan line at the 32nd parallel. And what that leaves is Tunis, Tunisia, and the southern top tip of Algeria and Morocco. That was Africa to the Romans. Okay, that was Africa. Egypt was Egypt. Ethiopia was the place south of Egypt, and Agisimba was a place in the desert and across the desert. Okay, but Africa was that place up there, and Africa may in fact be a Berber word. I don't know, but that's what some people have suggested.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So the thing is this.
So I'm just gonna chime in there about kind of like etymology of terms, of topologies over time, toponyms, so to speak. I think the ancient word for what we call Africa today was Ethiopia. I think that's what all the evidence suggests, and I think that was the case right up until essentially large parts of the continent started being renamed from about the 15th and 16th century onwards. But if you look at the old maps, you'll see that Ethiopia is used en masse. And I was speaking about this to the guys on the academy the other day as well, about the fact that I even think the renaming of Abyssinia to Ethiopia was done deliberately to create a lot of confusion, because essentially it took a whole continent's history and then it just literally placed it on the horn, on the borders of the continent, to a place that didn't historically call itself Ethiopia, a place that called itself, Abyssinia or Aksum, different names historically. But the name Ethiopia, you can see quite clearly, was the name for the continent. In fact, the Ethiopic Sea, like I like to point out, was the western side of Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian Sea is the kind of like the southern portion of what we now call the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, and the name of this sea was actually changed after it was called the Ethiopic Sea to the Western Ocean, or the Oceanus Occidentalis. I think that's the word they had for west. So it's changed over time, but this relation of Ethiopia, or the Ethiopic being the western portion of the continent, along with the central, along with the eastern, has always been historic. And I think a lot of our bias towards Ethiopia being a reference to the modern nation or the Horn of Africa is born out of presentism and the modern borders, which are sometimes but often not historically aligned to what things were called. So there's really little argument about the fact that I guess there was a period of time where the Kushites were regarded as Ethiopians. Okay, so there was a amount of time where the Kushites were regarded as Ethiopians, but really it was them, and then everyone south of them were also classified as Ethiopians to people who perhaps were not. If we look at the Ptolemaic maps, they're called Ethiopians. So this name for the continent being Ethiopia, actually, and I was postulating this the other day, it could even be endonymic. It might not necessarily be exonymic. This is the thing. It might be because I know we think it is called Ethiopia because of the Greek words ethio and ops, meaning face, but that isn't dead certain. That's kind of like a possibility, and there is a lot of evidence that a lot of names that people think are exonyms that were created by the Greeks just inherited them, and just put like an IA at the end or an S at the end and said that this is the name, but it doesn't necessarily mean they came up with that name. So it could have an endonymic naming convention, that name Ethiopia might not be one that's been cast from the outside. So that's another possibility that I think I'm very open to, specifically because I've been looking through the ancient Greek language and seeing that it's riddled with African words, like literally riddled with African words. And so this is just one of the things that I kind of have my eyes open to. So I just wanted to point out the fact that the name Ethiopia was the name for the continent. Africa is recent. It's a recent name that's been used. I don't think Africa was named after Leo Africanus like people like to claim. I don't think that's the case, but I also don't think it's been a name of the continent, so to speak, for a very long time. I think it goes back around 300 years max. So it's just something to consider there.
So if you went to, if you could go back in a time machine and talk to Roman about Africa, he's not going to know anything about any Zulu. Well, there were no Zulus then anyway. So I'm just trying to say that they wouldn't know that. So when it comes to Hannibal, were there people on those Punic ships and those Phoenician ships that sailed the Mediterranean that if we saw them today walking down the street in Baltimore that we would call black? Absolutely. We have DNA evidence to that effect. Now, we don't know, okay, if we did a DNA test on them, we would say that they were infra-Saharan or whatever. Craniofacially also, we have that type of evidence. I have a colleague who's done work on a place in Spain called Ibiza, which was a Punic colony that they settled. And you have this level of, you have high diversity there. And you have the range of people with craniofacial traits, all sub-Saharan often, all the way to the other end of the spectrum. Okay, so in that regard, my point that I'm trying to make simply is that I think that in some cases, in terms of the what people call Afrocentric, they are making a claim, and probably sometimes deliberately exaggerating to just make a point, to get into a room, so to speak, to have a point. But give me an example of
I got one for you. I got 2 points. People will say that the ancient Egyptians and their society called themselves black, and the ancient Egyptians traveled to West Africa and populated West Africa. That's definitely a common claim.
Okay, all right.
1 second. Let me read that back because I know that would have been a question argued in bad faith, and I wasn't really paying attention. Let me let me lace that one back. Okay.
All the way to the other end of the spectrum. Okay. So in that regard, my point that I'm trying to make simply is that I think that in some cases, in terms of the what people call Afrocentric, they are making a claim, and probably sometimes deliberately exaggerating to just make a point, to get into a room, so to speak, to have a point. But give me an example of
I got one for you. I got 2 points.
Okay.
People say that the ancient Egyptians and their society called themselves black, and the ancient Egyptians traveled to West Africa.
Okay, so he's made two claims. He says, first of all, the claims that ancient Egyptians called themselves black. Well, they called the land black. I think that's, you can't argue with that. And it's the same word for black was the same word for the land. Okay. Now, there's reasoning. People have different arguments about why they use the word black to refer to these, this kind of conglomerate of nation states, these 42 nomes, so to speak. There's arguments around it. Why did they call it? But there, you can't deny that it was called black. Now, some people have called it the Black Land, strictly in reference to the land itself. But you have to understand, if you call it the Black Land, you are appending words that didn't exist. Okay, Kemet was called black. Okay, that's what it was called. We can go back and forth, but that's what it was called. It was called black. Okay, Kem, black. Kem, black. That's what the land was called. Okay, it had an objectifier in the name, which suggested they were referring to perhaps a black object. But I'm not even going to give my reasoning about why I think it was called black. But I think that's irrelevant. The point being that, did their ancient Kemetic people call themselves black people? I'm not sure, but they definitely called themselves black. We are black. Welcome to black. Okay, now you could take that or with that whatever you want, but that goes without saying. You can't refute that. That's irrefutable fact. So you can kind of do with that what you like. I don't need to get in the middle of that one. Now, the second point that you raise is that the ancient Kemetic people traveled to West Africa. I don't hear this being argued that much, if I'm going to be totally honest with you. Okay, we know that there were migrations out of Kemet, okay, that went to various places. I don't personally think this is something that needs to be focused on or argued a lot. I like Tata, by the way. One Love Soul. Tata is why I call the land. I think that's the ancient name that they carried right the way through, to, at least to the end of the Middle Kingdom. But I think even beyond that, I don't think it was called Tawi. I think it was called Tata. So yeah, me and you are on a chord there. But the idea that they left Kemet and traveled to West Africa. First of all, there's not a majority. There's a minority of ethnicities that say they have origin on the eastern side of the continent. Okay, and the ones that say they have origin on the eastern side of the continent tend to have cultural continuities, linguistic links, and traditions that suggest that they were on the eastern side of the continent. Whether that was directly from Kemet, like you could argue, for instance, like, let me not talk about the eastern side, western side of the continent. Let me talk about, for instance, the Rwandan kings who can trace lineage all the way back to Seti and Ramesses. They actually have a unbroken lineage of kings that goes right back to Ramesses and Seti. That's unbroken. And then they have all of the cultural continuities that you can see from the crowns that they used to wear, from the rituals they conducted. So there's almost, it'd be very hard to argue against for instance, the Rwandan kingship and the Bugandan kingship, the Kabakas, etc. That there's a lineage that goes back to the Nile Valley. You could argue against it, but you'd just be argumentative at that point, because even the Europeans acknowledge that these people are descendants of the Kemites. Okay, so there wasn't much argument there. Now, in terms of, like I said, the West African ones, there's a few ethnicities that do trace their lineage back to the eastern side of the continent. Not all of them trace them back directly to ancient Kemet. So I think this is a bit of a straw man argument that's being raised here. Is there likely to be some cultural diffusion or even direct descent? I think that's very possible. But also, I don't think people hang their hat on the fact that they come literally from Kemet. I think that's neither here nor there. I don't think that's a point that needs to be argued. Like I said, I think you are your culture. You are what you practice more than, much more. So that's more important than your direct genetic ancestry, your genealogy. And if you see the continuity of culture, then you have to say that there's a relationship of, from ancient Kemet to ancient Kush to Meroe to the to Uganda to Buganda to Ethiopia to Somalia to Chad to Niger to Mali. This cultural continuity, this cultural threads its way right through Africa. And you can see the continuity of these cultures. I think it's a moot point saying, oh, I can trace my exact, I could trace my exact lineage to this pharaoh. It's a ridiculous argument that doesn't need to be argued. We're talking about a common fabric that is practiced in terms of culture and understanding and religion and ethnotrichology and dress, everything, all practice. Like, I can recognize Kemetic words in my native tongue. I can recognize Kemetic practices in the practices of my ancestors. That's a cultural thread that people can't steal with these kinds of straw man arguments. Now, I know that's, for some people, that kind of argument's not going to be satisfactory, but for me, it absolutely is. And I don't need to argue beyond that point. Because I think when people get into this kind of like very asinine, I think this is what genetics have done to people as well. Genetics have made people incredibly myopic, where everybody wants to trace a direct lineage to a specific point. And I think that is largely irrelevant. I do. And if those of you who've been in the show a long time know that that's the case for when it comes to me. I think it's largely irrelevant. I think the point is that if people are kind of culturally aligned, phenotypically aligned, practice the same things, have the same names, use the same words, have the same language, then essentially we're talking about the same people. They were birthed out of a single culture and they practice a single culture. To me, we don't have to argue beyond that point. But maybe that's my own perspective.
Okay. And populated West Africa.
Okay.
That's definitely a common claim.
Okay. All right. So
2 points.
On the issue about Egyptians calling themselves Black, I understand that there's a linguistic argument about that. It has to do with the determinative related to the sign for land, people, and what have you. Is this a legitimate discussion? I don't know. I can't comment on that. I wouldn't see any reason why they would call themselves Black, because they would have been in a place with a polyglot population just based on evolutionary history. Of course, they wouldn't know anything about that. And early on,
I love that. He said, I don't know why they would have called themselves Black, because they would have been in a society, in a situation with a polyglot population. So he's talking about the fact that people would be speaking different languages. Now, I'm not sure if he's talking about the fact that the ancient Kemites or the people of Tata themselves would have been speaking separate languages. I support that. I support the idea that the gnomes were different cultures, much like we have sea practice in in modern Africa, where you have these kind of like different ethnicities all kind of banding together towards kind of like a single commonality, but you have different languages being spoken. I think that would have been the case in Kemet. So you would have had that polyglot national identity as well. And I say national loosely because I think that's a very modern concept. The whole idea of nationalism as well, I don't think it existed. But you would have had this kind of like different languages being spoken, but also outside of that, like I think the point he's saying is that if outside of that people are speaking different languages, what's the point in calling yourself Black? I would argue, let me not push back, but I would argue this. First of all, ancient Kemet was incredibly influential, particularly in the Fertile Crescent Mediterranean region. So although people were speaking different languages, it was the cultural center that was pushing language out. It pushed out its alphabet, it pushed out a system of writing, and African languages pushed out their words to the rest of the world. So actually, I think it was in the benefit of most people to understand African languages, possibly starting with ancient Kemet because of its location. Secondly, I would argue, my point, and this is where I would agree with you, what would be the point in them calling themselves Black? But my argument would be more because it's definitely not racially Black, because race doesn't exist. And on top of that, everybody would have been Black anyway, in my opinion. So at that time in ancient Kemet, ancient Tatar, whatever you want to call yourself, like it's like Nigerians calling themselves Black. It's like, well, we're Black, Ghanaians are Black, Togoans are Black, Cameroonians are Black, Gabonites are Black, Malians are Black, Nigerians are Black, Senegalese are Black. What's the point in calling ourselves Black land if everybody around us is Black already? It doesn't kind of make sense. So this is why I've always kind of just leaned on the idea that the affinity towards Blackness came from the fact that their deities were all Black. and blackness was the kind of primordial color of perfection and eternity. Everything divine was black. Their gods were literally black-skinned beings. Okay, all the societies connected to them, their deities who they inherited from Kemet were black-skinned. So blackness was always kind of like had this synonymous relationship with divinity and eternity. So was them calling themselves black a kind of like a link to the fact that they viewed themselves as being the closest akin to God, or their closest akin to Godhead, or to God, to Godship? That's a possibility. I to me that makes more sense in my head, but I'm not going to get into kind of like in the middle of that entire like Kemet, black people, black land debate, because I think it's kind of moot personally. That's my personal point of view.
On the jokers, right? There would have been people in their midst who would not have been as black as others, according to Sheikh Anta Joke.
Right.
So he's calling them black from an ethic point of view. But although he also makes the claim on the same glyphs that they refer to black people. Again, I don't know enough about that. Now, when it comes to the issue of a migration thesis, Sheikh Anta Joke did have a thesis in one of his books, and I think some others, that there was a migration out of Egypt. I've never been able to, I think there were probably contacts and individuals or maybe small groups, but I see no evidence of a mass depopulation of Egypt at any one particular time. Okay. I don't see the kinds of rules of evidence that I would like to see archaeologically for that. I would expect to see certain markers and certain things. We'll talk about certain hints and influences. I think that either that may have a common cradle, or maybe there was some actual migration and influence, but I don't see, I mean, no.
Also, I think common cradle is a very, very strong argument. And this is what takes us back to the Green Sahara discussion that we were having earlier. The fact that people forget about the Green Sahara, and they forget about this kind of origin point for many of the African civilizations that would follow this fertile Green Sahara, where a lot of these cultures likely developed and diffused from. So once again, is it important to argue a migration directly from Kemet if we're talking about a migration from the Green Sahara, where a lot of that culture itself was birthed and then diffused into the rest of the African continent? Once again, I'm not saying that migrations directly from Kemet didn't happen. Mustafa Gadal has got an excellent book called Exiled Egyptians, which talks in detail about the migration of their Kemetic people down through Central and Southern Africa with receipts. So he makes a very strong argument that no, there was definitely migrations from Kemet into the rest of Africa. So I'm not arguing against the fact that happened, but I think Africa, or at least those African nations, have such historical kind of interconnection that the kind of effort to say this migration took place at this point from Kemet into West Africa, it kind of becomes like, why do we need to have that discussion? Because the argument about whether or not these people were African is settled. The argument about what they were culturally is settled. The argument about what they were physiognomically is settled. The argument about whether or not these people are related is settled. So all of these kind of more important arguments have already been settled. We don't need to argue about, when a migration took place, in my view.
No matter what anybody says, late stage Egyptian is not the same as Walla. Okay. Now, could they be related? Could they be related languages? Or if you want to talk about an earlier migration from east to west, depending on how far you want to go. You want to go back to that P2 ancestor. You want to go back to.
Hold that P2. We're going to talk about that P2. Hold that.
No, but if you want to go back to an earlier period, talk about east to west migration of people within Africa. Yeah, that's much more plausible, in fact, and very likely.
Absolutely.
But that's a different thing than saying Egyptians who were self-conscious of being Egyptians migrated. That's a different thing.
Okay.
So there may be something in certain ideas, but it may not be exactly the way people are thinking about it, and that may be because they haven't read certain books and what have you. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I'm glad.
All right, so we're about 3 hours in now, guys, and this has been a longest stream. I'm not gonna lie, you guys in the chat with your argument about Bantu migrations have been annoying the hell out of me. but I'm gonna give you an opportunity right now because I hate these pointless back and forth arguments. So I'm gonna give you an opportunity to join the live stream as we wrap this up, and let's have this discussion verbally and see if we can. You're laughing, Wildflower. Let's have this discussion verbally and see if we can come to some kind of common ground and leave this discussion buried, because it comes up quite a lot. And sometimes, thank you, Wildflower, for saying it's a great live stream, by the way. It comes up quite a lot, and I don't like to see you guys argue over semantics, which is why I see a lot of being thrown around at the moment. So who's brave enough? Let me know in the chat if you're brave enough to join the panel and to, it's okay, Liz. Let me know if you're brave enough to join the panel and have this discussion right now. Yeah, Magi Commander, that's going out to you. It's going out to, I think, Liz, Mr. K, Muzianda. You're all welcome. Who's brave enough? Who wants to come and join the panel and have the discussion, since you were talking over my live stream the entire time? Are you willing to are you willing to have the discussion live? Yeah, put your money where your mouth is. If so, I'll create the link right now, or I'll send you the link right now. Who's willing to come up? If you go quiet now, that means you were just here for an argument. You weren't here for a resolution. Muzzy Anderson, Magi exhausted his energy. Magi, you sound like you're willing to come, so I'm going to send you a link. Okay, I'm going to send you. In fact, I'm just going to put the link over there right now. If you do join, you need to put the name that you use on YouTube. Otherwise, I can't let you in. Okay, so you have to use the name that you use on YouTube, or I can't let you in. Wildflower's tired. Understood, Wildflower. Understood. Let me just quickly pin this link. Okay, we'll do this to wrap up anyway. Hopefully this won't take too long. We do this to wrap up. Feel free to join the stream. Yeah, you guys are maybe later. I'm not arguing with them about Bantu, but you argued over my whole stream. So yeah, it's funny how you guys were like, oh no, I'm too tired now. I'm too tired after spending the last hour in my chat having this back and forth about Bantu origins, and then given the opportunity, like, oh no, it's all right, King. No, we're good. Ha, ha. Well, ha. There you go. You see it, right, Rolo? See what I did there? Yeah. See what I did there? Yeah. That's a classic teaching technique. Yeah, you just go, oh, here you go. Take the chalk. There you go. Why don't you come and teach us, since you've got so much to say? Huh? Mr. Stewart, would you like to come to the front and tell everybody what you were? You're damn right I came for you. Next time, show some respect in the chat, man. Now, anyway, shout out to you guys. We are 3 hours in, and I am going to... Oh, Crawfordat is joining. Shout out Crawfordat. Let's get him on the stage. But I just want to say shout out everyone for joining. We are going to be wrapping up very, very soon, but I want my buddy Crawfordat to come and join us. And we'll have a little quick chat, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, I've joined him, but I can't see him, so I think I got to change my view. So let me do this.
Hello.
Yo, how you doing, brother?
How are you doing? It's been a long time.
I'm really good, man. I'm really good. Thank you for joining, man. What's going on?
I don't know if you remember, I've been working on the Afropedia project. I don't know if you remember, I sent you an email.
Yes.
It's on hold right now because I had some infrastructure problem. Let's say it like that. It's going to be back up soon. And I was just joining because it's been a long time. I just wanted to discuss a little bit.
Well, shout out to you. I appreciate how much effort those big projects take. So take it from someone who kind of like understands. Yeah.
Thank you.
But what's going on? Have you got any thoughts that you wanted to share?
Yes. I watched this interview quite some time ago. I think the professor is overall correct, but if you know me, I don't like the framing. Like we are closer to you and me on this vision. I don't like the framing of we constantly have to prove our presence, or influence on civilization where the burden of proof is on their side. I really don't like this framing. And on the question of did ancient Egyptian or Nile Valley African migrated east to west, to me it's also not really a question. Like there's so much evidence that this happened, not only from east to west but from east to south. It's probably the easiest anthropological case you can ever face. It's so fucking easy, and yet we're still on the defensive about all those questions. And for me, the problem is that we are trying to argue with people that do not care about the facts anyway. This is the biggest problem, the Eurocentrists, the Eurasian centrists in a bigger spectrum. They don't care about the facts. Like we can have a full book written 200 years ago about how North Africa back then was still largely Black African. They will still deny the truth, still deny. So it is, to me, in my opinion, we should focus on convincing our people and not producing arguments to convince them. We should produce arguments and counter-argument to their hypothesis that they can answer. Like this is why I love when you say we shouldn't even talk about the genetics, just talk about what percentage of Neanderthal ancestry they have. Because this is a done deal. You post that on the table, it's over. They have nothing to say. And if they say anything, it's going to be some bullshit that is based on nothing.
Yeah.
But for our people, we need to focus, we need to be way more aggressive. Because the gentleman that was interviewing him, I'm sure you know him, he's been, on the Smash Rock show, on the Ice of Consciousness for a very long time. He's part of those
I've fallen out with him
or whatever. Yeah, I know. I've been following all this shit for quite a while.
Yeah.
Like those motherfuckers are literally just delusional. It's useless to like we need to be way more aggressive intellectually instead of approaching it as some kind of political or cultural debate. It's not the case. Just the science is not on their side at all, and they keep lying 24/7, constant lies, and it's to me it's not sustainable. At some point, they're gonna do what they always did. They're gonna erase the evidence. They're gonna manufacture new evidence that this time match the narrative better, and we're gonna have to do everything all over again. So that's what I want to say.
I like your point that you raised there, and I have to say, broadly speaking, I agree with it. I think the only caution with being, because I agree we do need to be more aggressive, but I don't like to be aggressive I don't like to be aggressive and unequipped to defend my argument. And so I hate starting arguments with like, I believe that, that's not useful to anybody. It's not replicable. It's not useful to the community. So in as much as I might believe migrations have took place, I haven't armed myself. I'm speaking for myself here, not for you. I haven't armed myself with enough data to defend that position strongly. Do you know what I mean? And so for me personally, I can't, because I can't defend it yet with the kind of rigor and the kind of references that I like to go into debates and arguments with. I prefer to not front that position. I prefer to say, well, look, it's a possibility. It's a strong possibility. We've got a lot of evidence, but I need a certain amount of, weighty data before I go, okay, cool. No, this is what happened. And then I'm willing to go into a debate with it. So broadly speaking, I know that's probably what you're saying anyway. I broadly agree with you, but it leaves a to do for me to say, actually, let me do more work here. Because if or even for yourself, you're saying, if you think this is really important for us to have that discussion about the migrations that have took place, and you might have done the work already, let's get that evidence collated into a single place so that we can argue with strength and not with emotions. Do you know what I mean?
Of course.
Yeah.
I want to be a bit more precise about what I meant. When I say be more aggressive, I say, like, for example, in the case of detractors that say no West African have no connection to ancient East African, that's already a scientific statement you're making. Like this, you're posing this as a scientific fact. But the question I have for them is, okay, then what is the origin of the West African people? These questions they have no answer to. I'm telling you, they don't have any answer to this question.
Yeah.
They have small pockets of population that you can find are very ancient in Nigeria, in Mauritania, Senegal. But other than that, we have nothing. So we have a big problem. And second, on just the migration from east to west, I have Wolof ancestry. So I'm just going to point to you the direction where all the evidence lies. The Wolof and the Dinka of Sudan have an enormous amount of cultural equivalency.
Absolutely.
Like sometimes we have the same family name, we have the same cultural tradition of wrestling, we have the same physical phenotype, like we are tall, lanky, and very black, exactly like them. Like this is why I started by saying that this is an extremely easy case for trained anthropologists. Trained anthropologists can find the evidence and point the relationship like that. The problem is that nobody wants to do that. And the reason why they don't want to do that because nobody is forcing them to actually have a real empiric for the base for the hypothesis and the narrative. Every time someone telling me the West African have no connection to the North African or the East African, I'm like, okay, where the fuck are my ancestors coming from then?
Absolutely.
No answer. They have no answer.
Yeah. Can I chime in on that as well?
Of course.
I think a lot of the people who have this kind of like obsession with splitting, Africa by compass points, north, east, south, west, they're the ones who tend to be quite genetically obsessed as well. And what they don't realize, like I even saw people talking about, oh, you need to put your ancestry into this thing and it's got to. What they don't realize is a lot of these labels that have been picked up by these kind of like ancestry groups, and they've decided because this marker has its highest frequency here, it originated here. They don't understand that they're exercising pseudoscience, because even these genetic tests will claim things like that. Oh, East and West Africa split. It was a 40,000 years ago, something stupid. Or even some models say even longer, like 100,000 years ago, East and West Africa split. And it's like, are you dumb? You know nothing about the topography of Africa. You know nothing. Like, for instance, your example that you raised earlier about Sudan and the Wolof, having massive cultural overlap. Yeah, that's because the empires were literally across the Sahel. Okay, literally banded from one side of the Sahel to the other. That's how the ethnic groups were in that portion of Africa. So in the Sahelian and the Maghrebian region, they went across in long bands. In addition to this, like for instance, I could just talk about Nigeria. In Nigeria, the most spoken language is an Afro-Asiatic language, or what we call an Afro-Asiatic language. That's the most spoken language. Okay, it's Afro-Asiatic. Hausa, Afro-Asiatic language. Yeah, so people are trying to argue this kind of east-west split. It's kind of like literally the most spoken language is the Afro-Asiatic language of the Chadic branch. And you're trying to talk to a Nigerian about these massive splits of people who have never, like, they're still there. They're still regional. They still trace back their ancestry going back thousands of years, but they're speaking the Afro-Asiatic language. So make that make sense. They can't make it make sense because they don't understand these are people who have never been to the continent often, to be honest with you. It's often people who haven't been, it's often Europeans or people who haven't been to the continent who think you can split Africa in that way. It's kind of like you don't understand Africa one bit. You don't understand it. If you went there, you would understand the African movement and diversity is literally written into the genetics. I spoke about it at the start of the stream. It's written into the genetics. You can't split Africa into these pockets of populations. We don't have inbred genetics. It doesn't work.
I'll push back a little bit on that because we can make some distinction between Africans. Like, for example, there is the
you can't make distinctions, to be clear.
Like between the Southern African and the Sahelian Central African, there is a rainforest that acted as a barrier for quite a while. So there is some differentiation here. But what I'm saying is that
let me clarify what you just said. Between the Southern Africans
between the Southern African, like everything below Congo, more or less, well, kind of split from the rest because of the rainforest for a long time. There is a type of fly that kills, that is extremely deadly to horses, camel, and stuff like that. So actually, for a while,
So okay, but
the,
you do. But let me just jump in really quickly. You do realize that the Congolese speak a language that's very closely related to Southern Africans.
yes, I know. But what I'm meaning is that on a in terms of
So by the way,
commercial
I'm not saying
roads,
everyone's the same in Africa. I'm saying that you can't argue these large splits that happened thousands of years ago and the people never met. That's not
but
true.
it's not.
There's
Yeah,
evidence of
yes,
that.
I agree with that. What I meant is that there is somewhat of a split in Africa. For example, you can see that all the Muslim countries in Africa are above this line because going below, it was really hard if you had a horse or a camel. Like you can only go over there by feet or by sea. So there was somewhat of a separation. But above that, above this line, it's exactly like Eurasia. It's a ginormous plain from Ethiopia to Senegal. There's a huge plain. You can just walk forward and go and get on the other side of the continent.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I think there
okay. So
has to be
I
like
just want to push back on that very quickly. That's a point you're making. It's not a refutation. So I think I just separate those two things. Yeah. So you're
Yes,
making a
yes, yes.
point that yes, okay, there's cultural differences. I'm not saying that Africa is culturally identical and that all people have the equal amount of genetic diversity. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you can't make these huge splits in the continent and say the East never mixed with the West or the South never mixed with the North and they were split for thousands of years because there's no evidence to suggest such a thing. I'm not suggesting that, obviously. You know,
Yes,
we can
that's
see where
also not
Islam
what
has
I'm
spread
suggesting.
or Christianity has spread, or obviously we got cultural differences, but depending on our exposure to different things. So that's those are two different things. I want to kind of separate those points. What you're saying is not a pushback against
yeah,
what I was saying, it's just an
I
observation.
think Diop's Black Unity. Diop has this text, Black African Unity, the cultural unity of Black Africa. It talks exactly about this. There is cultural unity, but we've got localized differences, and I think that's what both of you are talking
Yes,
about. Where
exactly.
the confusion comes is where we try to collapse the large swaths of time. For instance, talking about the difference between, let's say, finding the Christians on the coastal areas and the Muslims in the northern part of West Africa, that's a recent phenomenon. For instance, the reason the Akans are in where they are in Ghana is because they were running away from Islam. The Akans were within the areas of Wagadu, the ancient Ghana Empire. If you hear how they got to where they are, it's because Islam came and because of that, people migrated. So these migrations have some form of political reasons, not reasons that existed, let's say, millennia or even centuries. So I think one can
Correct.
analyze this properly, just that it has to be within a proper framework and we can see what is natural and what is created by human events. So that's my bit on that. But King, this is the first time I'm talking to you. I'm just here to congratulate you on your
Thank
work.
you. Who is
Mostly,
this? So this is this last Griot? Because it doesn't show who's
yeah,
speaking.
correct. That's
Okay,
last
cool.
grill. That's
Shout out
that's
to
the
you.
name I
Sorry, carry
use.
on,
Yeah.
brother.
I've been checking your work out. I think I'm on the Patreon. I joined years ago and just left it. I'm probably there. So just to congratulate your work.
Appreciate you. I need the money.
No problem. I think yeah, it's even more important now than before. I saw your videos on the other channel, the King's Mono Show,
Mm,
the recent one with regards to the tragedy, and again to congratulate you. I think you saw this before it happened. It's
mm,
just now that I saw the videos and I realized that you were talking about this. What was, the framing, etc., etc. I saw
mm,
Kehinde Andrews' interview, and then I saw yours, and I'm like, King knew this. You were just talking about this, and
mm.
I know this is not the channel for that conversation, but I feel that event is linked to the ancient Egyptian question. I think that, and this is the way I'm seeing it. When the issue started, one would think this was a right wing issue.
Mm,
What shocked me to the core was that the whole of the country, and I could even say the whole of the West, because this thing ended up in America,
mm,
left, right. everyone thought the late professor was actually guilty of the allegations.
Mm.
Although it was merely allegations, and those allegations had been refuted because there was an investigation. The university said, no, we didn't find this. The other allegations with regards to endurance training, all of it, there is evidence this guy actually did that. In fact, none of the flagship allegations are still standing.
Yep.
And both the left and the right, the shock was the left, couldn't even take a step back and look at this thing. And the only thing that explains that reaction is that it could be that intrinsically people felt the late professor didn't deserve that position.
Yep.
And I think that is the painful truth. And the way this links to the ancient Kemet issue is this. Should the world come out and say, look, we agree the ancient Egyptians are black, people will protest. That's what I'm seeing. If scientists come out today and say, you know what, we give up, the ancient Egyptians were black, they'll say, we don't even care about you scientists. Similar with the late professor, it got to a point where people didn't care about the evidence. We're just making things up. They were literally making things up. The thing with regards to the book advance, the professor didn't say they paid him that. He said he was offered. In the article, they changed it to he was paid. He said he was paid. Even the lady who made a tweet about it, this is a lie, and she's still tweeting about it. So to my point, it's just a reminder of the position in which we are. Sometimes you think there is progress. This is an intellectual battle. Let's talk about who has the evidence, etc. No. It's a different framework. It seems there are people there who know exactly what's going on and they want to control where the world goes. They can't keep the late professor at his position doing that type of decolonization work at a top university. In the same way, the world can't accept a black Egypt. So it's no longer about decolonizing Egyptology or decolonizing institutions at this stage. And from my perspective, the work that you are doing at this point, you just do the work. Those that don't accept it, yeah, they just go and look for, their echo chamber where they think they are skeptics. They often people think they are smart. You see, like the late professor situation, the black people, I'll say black here, because that was a painful part. Black people felt that they had to be overly objective. Otherwise, people would think they were also beneficiaries of DEI. You can see there was this identity distancing. Then you are like, damn, why would you do that? It's so shocking. I saw your pain in the video and I'm like, I feel your pain, bro. I feel your pain. So from my perspective, it's linked and you did great work with those videos on the Keen Mono show. I think the late professor will be pleased with what you did. And it's just unfortunate what happened. And it should be a reminder to all of us that in the few positions or few professions that we are, you have to identify how much vulnerability you've got, how exposed you are. And this goes to the especially the journalists, the black journalists involved. Because when I think about it, to me, it felt like they had to take a particular position because they're in a compromised situation. Imagine you're part of a left-wing media, a popular media house, and this thing is out there. Your colleagues will probably think you are beneficiary of the same DEI. So you have to toe a harder line against your own people. So I commend you, bro. I commend you. And I hope one day, we link up when you're in London. I'm based in London. I'll get in touch through the Patreon portal. I'm sure there's a way to get in touch personally.
Yeah, you can DM me. You can DM me on there.
Yeah,
definitely.
All right, bro. So good work, excellent work. We're always watching in the background, even if we do not comment or make any remarks. Your work is having greater impact than you imagine.
Appreciate you, brother. I appreciate that a lot. Appreciate that a lot.
Yes. Hi, King. Great live stream. I'm really enjoying it. And yeah, so sorry what was going on in the chat. It was a little
bit. Man. Bombing my chat with your I'm just joking. Go, carry on.
I even lost focus. I apologize. And also hi everyone on the panel. Hi everyone in the chat. So basically, there's this argument. It's not even. It's people are coming up with weird theories saying that the word Bantu was coined by some German linguist, and people who identify as Bantu people, like myself, we find it really upsetting and insulting because the word Bantu exists in our language. You have a single person is called a Muntu, and then the things we use are called Bintu. So this Ntu has been existing before a white person came to Africa. And there are some black people that tend to be like, oh, no, this is a made up word. This is a made up ethnic group. And I just really hope one day you will kind of deal with that, because it's creating a split. And I think when, our opponents kind of see any split happening between black people, they jump onto that. And I feel like it has to be kind of straightened out at some point, hopefully when you get some time, because there's a lot of people that will go along, oh, this is not even a real ethnic group, or this is not even, this word was made up by some European. And it's very upsetting because when you try to correct people and say, actually, this is an African word, it has African origins. There are multiple other words that are the same theme: untu, bintu, chintu, kantu. So to say, oh, a white man came and he just coined the word, it's very upsetting. But this is why I was going back and forth. I didn't mean to just be.
No, it's all right. I'm tongue in cheek telling you off. Let me just say, I'm tongue in cheek telling you off. And I will say this before, because I think someone's about to jump in, and you're welcome to. But just give me a second. I will say this before you start, that Bantu, the word Bantu, is definitely endonymic. So it definitely comes from within Africa. There's no way a European invented that term. So that argument needs to be abandoned straight away, because you can't just invent a term that can be deconstructed in the local languages. So I'll just say that one point. And I think someone's going to come in at that point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This is Magi, bro.
How you doing, Magi?
Chilling, what's going on? So look, that wasn't the argument, right? The argument was that the guy used it as an umbrella, okay, to like put together a whole bunch of languages into one and say, well, that's Bantu. You understand? That's what I was saying. Not that he invented the word or anything of that nature. Okay. I know it's an ancient word.
Okay. So let me just ask you a question. Do you have the same critique for the Semitic speakers?
As far as it being born in a horn?
No, but no, as far as it existing or not existing, because Greenberg put a sign on it and said Semitic, but we'd still agree that all of those languages are related, correct?
Right. It's an African language.
What, Semitic?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you agree that all the Semitic languages have a shared origin?
I agree.
Okay, so then you're okay with the fact that shared origin might link to a kind of origin point for those Semitic speakers?
Sure.
Okay, so I don't think we have an argument then, because I think that's the argument that Wildflower was raising, that there's a shared Bantu. The Bantu speakers all share kind of a language film, and that points to a kind of common origin for all of the Bantu speakers, correct?
But see, that's what I was trying to explain to her. I'm like, I'm not arguing that. What I was saying was that since my man put together, he just lumped everything into one for people. It's like there's no actual Bantu. That's not a Bantu group or ethnic group like that. You understand? So like there's like no Bantu tribe until these people started putting together terms and whatnot to lump people into one. That was my argument.
Okay, so would you? I'm gonna have to ask that with the same question I just gave you. So would you say that there's no Shemite lineage then?
Shemite lineage, like as in the Bible?
No, as in Semitic speakers. Would you say that there's no relationship between those groups?
I don't know how to answer that, because first of all, I don't deal with the Bible.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to answer that. You know what I'm saying? Like, does it have a shared origin? Sure it does. But I mean, as far as in a biblical sense, no.
Can I answer that? Because I cannot agree.
I guess the point let me just, yeah, you can, but just let me just quickly finish your point. But the reason that I raised that as a point was that a people and a lineage can exist, and that people and a lineage, and this happens a lot, by the way, can be picked up and bastardized by a European, but that doesn't erase the people and the lineage existing. So they might pick it up and they might, for instance, overextend it or extend it incorrectly. However, that doesn't suddenly erase the history of a people who perhaps identified with that term. Now, I'm not saying that's this case here, but I'm saying that's something that I've seen happen a lot on the African continent, you know. So, for instance, the people surrounding the Niger River, who were then given the exonym Negroes, okay, which eventually over time became something totally meaningless. But at the moment it was coined, people who were called Negroes and were all basically people who resided around the Niger and were called the Negrita as an exonym by outsiders. But essentially, they were a people who shared a cultural kind of home point, being that we all are from around the Niger River. So, yes, I'm trying to kind of like, understand, does the fact that a European has picked it up and bastardized it invalidate its credence as a thing?
Where I would push back is that for Semitic, I can't say it's true. Like there is not, we can point to an ancient Semitic tribe that is the ancestor of all the Semitic speaking people. Like that's just not the case. It's very obvious that's not the case. And I agree with him on the problem of the Bantu classification, because it is scientifically arbitrary. It's not because those languages share vocabulary, share some form of similarities that it proves genetic ancestry. And I think I read a paper from an African scholar that was making this argument, that I think Obenga was making this argument as well, that there is not a real genetic ancestry in those languages, and it is more or less arbitrary. Since all those people come from the same region, ultimately, obviously there are a relationship in their world, in their culture, but it is ultimately arbitrary. Just like, in my opinion, Semitic is more or less arbitrary, and it doesn't reflect like the ancestry of the people and the speakers are not the same. Like the most of the Semitic speaker today have almost nothing in common with the ancient Semitic people.
Right.
Okay. Thanks for that answer. Liz, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, are they now trying to say that there is no ethnic groups that is Bantu? There's just a language. But you need an ethnicity to create a language, don't you need that? Or am I just...
Not necessarily, because of the way that the European coined stuff. They do that and then mess up people's history. They do it. They've done it all the time.
No, we know the things. We have our culture. We have our culture that is different from other African groups. You have the groups that's been labeled as Nilotic, Semitic, Cushitic, all these things. But our culture is one of the main identifiers that our ethnic group is different. The way we have our practices, the way we have our spirituality, the way we speak, and then it's actually manifested in the way our phenotype is. So you could come to East Africa and you could tell someone who is a Bantu ethnic group, someone who falls into a Nilotic ethnic group, and then someone who falls into so-called Cushitic ethnic groups, and they all have a different culture. They speak differently. This is how we were able to kind of like see who comes from which ancestry. These things about who's your forefathers, it's very important in our culture that everybody needs to know who their great-great-grandfathers, what clan you're from. So these things are not just randomly a European came and started putting us in group. We were already in groups.
We're making an argument about the linguistic aspect of it. Like, we're not denying the ancestry. Like, I'm from West Africa, and he is the same, but the European linguists literally put us all in the same basket of Niger Congo, where we all know our different ethnic group, we all know where we come from, and we all know our differences. But from their perspective, in their science, all of this is just Niger Congo.
Yeah, but
That's what I'm saying.
we don't call ourselves Niger Congo. We are called the Bantu people, and then one person in the group is called a Muntu. So we already knew who. We don't need someone to come and tell us that. Oh, now you because when the Europeans came to our part of Africa, they realized we were separating ourselves from other black groups, and we would call ourselves Abantu, just to know we were an ethnic group. We were not just saying that means people, but they took it to mean people. It doesn't mean people. It's a word that is referring to an ethnicity.
But it's also used in South Africa.
Because the Southern Africans came from us. That's why I understand language in South Africa.
I
It's
can't
an
argue
ethnic,
that. That's
it's
true.
an ethnic group that traveled from East Africa all the way to the southern part of Africa. That's why we have the same cultural practices, the same languages. We had a starting point. So when people say, oh, it's just a language group, it is not a language group. It is ethnic identified. That's how we identify ourselves. This is why we could say, this is why, you can say that Idi Amin, who was a president in my country, he's not a Bantu man, but he's black. And someone who's outside my group will think he's a Bantu. He's not. He was someone from Sudan. He's a Nilotic. We can tell right away by looking at each other.
What I mean is that if you go and look at the linguistic classification and what people they correspond to, can you say, okay, all of those people are actually linked to me, and this man did a perfect job of mapping who is Bantu and who is not? My argument is not that there is not a Bantu identity or ethnicity. The argument is that the European did a poor job of properly defining the boundaries. Like,
Correct.
I understand that. I understand that. But to say that we're not just a language group, these are actually ethnic identified that we use even now. Like this is a problem in East Africa because we have multiple black branches all living in the same areas. This is where we get ethnic tensions because we know, oh, this is a Nilotic, this is a Cushitic, this is a Bantu, all living in the same area.
But this is the thing. You have to understand that we are 300. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Continue. Sorry, continue.
We are a 300,000-year-old people. There is no way that you can say, well, I'm this one thing, or I'm this one thing, or I'm this one thing. You can't say that because we are a mixture of every part of the continent. You understand what I'm saying? So you can't
I'm gonna disagree with that argument. I have to disagree with that argument because
okay.
I get the point they're saying but you're arguing a genetic argument here. And I think the argument being argued is not a genetic argument.
But she's separating it by a language.
No, but it doesn't matter. Their ethnic groups exist in Africa, and that's the bottom line. They do exist, and they are real. So ethnic groups do exist. They are real, and people identify with them. And I think the argument being raised here is that the Bantu ethnic group or the Bantu ethnicity as a people, as an identifier, did exist prior to the bastardization of Greenberg. Although I think you're all correct in that Greenberg
I agree.
Probably did a horrible job. So I think we all agree with that. He did a horrible job of all of Africa. But that doesn't then negate the fact that Bantu as an ethnicity exists, and actually many, I'm not saying all, I'm sure you guys, Liz could probably answer better for me, but many of the Bantu speaking ethnicities do share both language and cultural commonalities. But I think we're all agreeing that there's errors in as a result of the European bastardization of the term.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But
cool.
I
agree, but sorry.
I just wanted him to elaborate a little bit more on what he's saying, expound on it. Something.
On what?
On as far as like the more common ethnicities, because that's kind of a hard thing to pin down.
Okay, so I'm gonna talk because I wanted to take the example of West Africa, because there's not that much difference between West Africa and East and South Africa. There's maybe more ethnic group in West Africa than East and South Africa. But on our side, the linguistic is so obviously incredibly bad. I don't know if you realize, but we have people that have lived together, mingled together for thousands of years. and the European will say there is barely any relationship between the two languages that are completely different families. I'm giving this example with Afro-Asiatic and Niger Congo. Like in the Sahel, we have so-called Afro-Asiatic population and Niger Congo population. Those people have always lived together, always. It is
Yep.
literally an arbitrary line, arbitrary linguistic line, arbitrary. Like it is pseudo-scientific to the max. That's why I was pushing back originally, because I believe they did the same everywhere. They just put arbitrary lines that are more or less aligned with some historical, cultural differences. Because indeed, there is a difference between the nomad of the desert and the agricultural people of the Sahel. There's a difference. But this is not enough to draw hard line in the sand and say this is completely different.
Right.
Our arguments are really that the linguistic technique of the European are just incomplete and more or less pseudoscience. That's what I want to say.
I would agree with that broadly. And actually, just with the kind of linguistic work that I've been doing recently, I think there's a model for a kind of like a table of phylogeny for languages as opposed to these separate groups. I think that's ridiculous what Greenberg's created. And I think obviously, I also got to say, I think a part of that is obfuscating the link between Africa and Europe, because Europe doesn't want to admit that they inherited language from Africa. And I think it's I think it's actually visible, tangible, and provable. And by creating these groups in Africa, they create this kind of like separation, and then they can create this mythical proto-Indo-European nonsense where they can make up words and claim that that's where all their language came from. In reality, a lot of their words came from directly from the African continent, and it's very provable. So I think the model is actually that you can do these tables, these kind of phylogenetic tables, similar to what we do with genetics, where you can see which languages branch from which. Because I'm of the strong impression, I'm going to be proving it soon, that the Semitic languages descend from Yoruba, Igbo, and Ewe. And I can actually prove that quite strongly. That would place them in the eastern region of the globe historically. Now, this can be proven with linguistics, and obviously that throws into the pan the whole idea of there being this Niger Congo supergroup, because it's then not going to be related to other groups that perhaps were in the west of Africa, far into antiquity. So these tables need to be created and drawn up from scratch. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not going to be a short job. It's going to be a very, very complex job to do that. But I think that this can be done over time. But yeah, no, first of all, guys, like I'm gonna kind of like sign off, let you give your sign-offs as well. But I want to thank you for coming on, and thank you for resolving that really nicely. Because I thought that was gonna be beef, but that was wicked the way you guys resolved that. That was fantastic.
No,
so
we're not gonna
be mature about that. I appreciate
it.
We're
not gonna argue that.
Thank you, panel.
All right.
No, shout out to you. I'm signing off now. Medjai, I'm gonna give you an opportunity to say your last words.
Oh no, man! Just thanks for having me, man.
Pleasure.
I'm always around.
Pleasure, my G. Thank you for coming on. RJ, I barely heard from you. Go on.
I came on to say hi. It's been a while since I tuned into one of these streams, so it was great. I miss most of it, but because the panel was on, I was like, oh, let me come in and say hi. So I didn't know there was some discussion going on earlier. So yeah, but I'm glad to hear people's thoughts. Yeah, I don't have much to say, but yeah, as you guys mentioned earlier about the genetic connection with every ethnic group in Africa, it's like there's no separation. It's a colonial thing, trying to divide, and that's how they are able to take Egypt and Nubia and all that stuff from us. So yeah, but take care, guys. Have a good afternoon.
Shout out to you.
Hey, TKM.
Yo.
Look, I do want to have a word with you at some point. Like I said, I might catch you over at Controversy or whatnot. But I wanted to speak on the DNA thing real quick because I was a part of that, of course. What I was saying,
Sorry, I'm gonna leave. I'm just letting you finish. I'm just gonna say thank you, King. I've
go
been
ahead.
working a lot. I'm gonna show you my project soon.
Can't
Probably
wait
gonna
for it,
be
brother.
very interesting.
Yeah.
See ya.
All
Thank
up.
you.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, man. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you. I'm off.
Peace, Crawford. Thanks for that. Yeah, go ahead, Medjai. You can sign us
Yeah.
off, man. Go on.
Okay. All I wanted to say was there is no one way that you can find like one tribe. That was my point. My point was that, we're genetically crossed, period,
Yeah,
across that.
100%.
But to do some type of mapping, you know what I mean? Just to do a slight mapping. And you can't, of course, you're not going to pinpoint anything unless you're from the continent itself. You understand? And you can reach back, through your ethnic group or whatnot. But I was just saying that instead of the guy taking like African ancestry to take the DNA situation where you can download your raw DNA, your raw data and whatnot, and this is for people who are outside the continent or whatever, to try to map out some things. That's what I was saying.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think my issue, and this will take us to a longer conversation, so I'm gonna try and not.
Yeah, no, we'll catch up
We'll
on
have
that
this.
one.
We'll definitely have this. But my only issue lies with the classifications of DNA, of how it's being, because you're saying raw DNA, and that's I appreciate the fact. Okay, cool. You've got your raw DNA. You've done your autosomal or your nuclear. You've got those raw results. But the issue's never been with the DNA itself. The DNA is fine. It's pure. It's sacrosanct, so to speak. The issue is with how the DNA is being analyzed.
Oh yeah,
and the problem is the DNA has been analyzed through biased Eurocentric genotyping arrays since this entire exercise begun. And so we're not looking at it. We think we're looking at it from an objective lens, and it's placing this label on this DNA. Oh, this is Turkish. This is and it's like,
oh
no, it isn't. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah,
this is my issue with it. It's all Eurocentric. It's heavily weighted towards these Eurocentric lenses, which change, which falsely apply labels to certain markers, and even that is the most refutable part of it. So even when people put in their DNA into things like GEDmatch, you have to understand this is every single DNA database has been influenced by a historical narrative to classify where things originate. None of it is just kind of like pure. There's always kind of like a narrative that's linked to it. So they'll say, well, you're from here, so that means 500 years ago you were over here, and so therefore we're going to label that DNA this thing based on a historic narrative that we've been given, not based on what it is in its raw sense. So the issue has always been the phylogeny and the narrative, the anthropological narrative that's been attached, which I think is flawed at the base. So that's why I'm always going to be like very skeptical of anything that runs through those type of arrays. Does that kind of make sense? Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've seen the lies. I've written the paper on it, so I know exactly what you're talking about, right? So I know exactly. Okay.
Cool. All right. Well, let's pick this up. I could we'll message each other on Camji's Discord, and we'll link up that way. Yeah.
That works for me. All right, man.
All right. Nice one, my brother. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, man. Same here. Peace.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I think that's going to be a sign off. I just want to give a quick shout out to a few people who generously donated. To shout out to Raphael Akhenaten for your 2 donations. They're very, very appreciated, totaling $70. So thank you, brother. I appreciate you appreciating my time. Thank you, James Stewart, for your 2 donations, totaling $10, much appreciated. And shout out Crenshaw Grinder, who kicked us all off with a $5 donation. You are very much appreciated. Everybody have a fantastic day, and I'll see you all very soon. Peace.